Chapter 1. The Weight of Words. There's a moment in Season 4 I keep coming back to. Not the governor's tank rolling through the fences, not the sword at Herschel's throat. Something quieter. It's the moment just before, when Herschel Green sits alone on the edge of his bunk in cell block D, threading his fingers through his worn leather Bible, watching the pre-dawn light filter through the barred windows. The book falls open to Ecclesiastes, and his thumb traces the margin where he'd written, "Patience is bitter, but its fruit is sweet," in pencil, sometime back on the farm, before Walker's, before everything changed, before he learned what those words actually cost. What if, in that moment of waiting, Herschel had understood something the rest of them missed? What if the old veterinarian who'd spent his life healing instead of hurting saw a path none of them could see? Tonight, let's follow that thread. Let's ask what happens when the wisest man in the room finally decides to speak. The dream had been about his father again. Not the way he died, old and bitter, full of disappointment about the farm that never quite paid for itself, but the way he taught. Herschel remembered being 16, impatient with a breached calf that wouldn't come easy, ready to pull hard and fast to get it done, his father's weathered hand stopping his wrist. "Boy," he'd said, tobacco-stained teeth showing through his beard, "some things can't be hurried. You pull too hard, too fast, you lose them both. Sometimes the kindest thing is to be patient with the pain." In the dream, they'd saved the calf. Both of them. Herschel opened his eyes to the sound of engines, distant but growing closer. He'd been dreaming of patience, but the world outside had no interest in waiting. The cell block was still mostly quiet, just the soft sounds of sleeping people who'd forgotten, temporarily, that they were refugees. Beth humming something barely audible in her sleep 2 cells down. Glenn and Maggie's whispered conversation filtering through the concrete. The ordinary sounds of a family that had somehow managed to build itself inside prison walls. These people trusted him to help keep them safe. They looked to him for wisdom, for guidance, for the kind of moral certainty he wasn't sure he possessed anymore. But he was all they had. Herschel pulled himself upright, reaching for his crutches. His left leg, what remained of it, throbbed with the phantom pain that never quite left, a reminder of the last time they'd thought they'd found safety. The farm had taught him one kind of loss. The prison had taught him another. Each amputation, literal or metaphorical, had carved away something he thought he couldn't live without. And yet here he was, still breathing, still hoping, still believing that tomorrow might be different than today. The engines were louder now, close enough that he could distinguish the rumble of heavy vehicles from the higher pitch of motorcycles, close enough to count them. Too many to be friendly. Herschel made his way to the watchtower window, moving quietly between the sleeping forms of people who'd become more than family. They'd become his congregation, though they'd never asked for the role, and he'd never formally accepted it. Through the reinforced glass, he could see them, a convoy of mismatched vehicles forming up just outside optimal rifle range, military precision hiding behind civilian camouflage. And there, climbing out of the lead truck with the careful movement of a man who'd learned to project authority through stillness rather than bluster, the governor. Philip Blake looked older than when they'd last seen him, greyer, but there was something harder in his posture now. Something that had calcified during his time in the wilderness. He'd lost Woodbury, lost his people, lost whatever illusion of civilization he'd been maintaining. But he'd found new followers, and new followers meant new leverage. The tank behind his truck wasn't just a weapon, it was a statement, a promise that this time there would be no negotiations, no half measures, no walking away. Herschel watched the governor survey the prison's defenses with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent months planning this moment. He was counting weaknesses, calculating angles, preparing to take by force what he couldn't claim by right. It was the logic of the world they lived in now. Strength made truth, violence made law, and the righteous inherited nothing but graves. "Herschel!" Rick's voice came from behind him, rough with too little sleep and too much weight. "Saw you up. Figured you'd seen them too." Rick Grimes moved like a man carrying invisible burdens, each step careful and measured. The leader who'd never asked to lead, who'd kept them alive through impossible circumstances by making impossible choices. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there on the farm, a tremor in his hands that he tried to hide, but Herschel always noticed. Rick had paid a price for keeping them safe, had sacrificed pieces of his own soul to preserve theirs. The question was how much more he had left to give. "They're not here for negotiation," Herschel said quietly, still watching the governor organize his forces. "Look at the formation. He's planning to take the whole place." Rick nodded, his jaw working. "Daryl's getting everyone ready. Glenn's on the other watchtower. Carol's moving the kids to the inner cells." A pause. "We could try to parley. Buy some time. Or we give him Michonne." The words came out flat, factual, like he was discussing the weather, but Herschel could hear the weight behind them, the way Rick's voice caught slightly on Michonne's name. That's what he wants. That's what he's always wanted. We give him her. Maybe he leaves the rest of us alone. Herschel turned from the window to study Rick's face. There was a hardness there, the kind of practiced emotional distance that let good men do terrible things when the situation demanded it. Rick wasn't suggesting they betray Michonne because he was cruel or calculating. He was suggesting it because he was desperate, because he'd run out of other options, because the weight of protecting so many people had convinced him that some sacrifices were necessary. That was the tragedy of it. Rick's logic was sound, cold, brutal, pragmatic, but sound. "No," Herschel said simply. Rick blinked. "Herschel, I know it's not. No." Herschel's voice carried the quiet authority of a man who'd made up his mind. "We don't trade lives. We don't sacrifice one person to save the rest. That's not who we are. It's who we have to be if we want to survive. Some things are more important than survival, Rick." They looked at each other across the cell block, two men who'd lost everything except their principles, arguing about whether those principles were worth dying for. Outside, the governor's engines idled. Inside, their people slept, trusting them to find a way forward that didn't require choosing between their humanity and their lives. "Then what do you suggest?" Rick asked, "because I'm out of ideas that don't end with all of us dead." Herschel was quiet for a long moment, thinking about his dream, about his father's hands on his wrist, about patience and pain and the cost of pulling too hard, too fast. He was thinking about Dale, who'd tried to be the moral center of their group until a walker's teeth had silenced his voice forever. Dale had believed that how they survived mattered as much as whether they survived. He'd died for that belief, and they'd mourned him, but they'd also moved on. They'd let the practical concerns of staying alive eclipse the harder question of staying human. But maybe, Herschel thought, it was time for someone to try a different approach. "Let me talk to him," Herschel said. Rick stared at him. "What?" "Let me be the one who walks out there. Let me try to find a way through this that doesn't require anyone to die. Herschel, you saw him out there. You saw the tank. This isn't the kind of problem that gets solved with conversation." "Maybe it is." Herschel reached for his crutches, his mind already working through possibilities, through words that might bridge the gap between Philip Blake's pain and their community's need for safety. Maybe that's exactly what kind of problems this is. Rick was shaking his head before Herschel finished speaking. I can't let you do that. I can't send you out there alone to face him. You're not sending me, Herschel said gently. I'm choosing to go. He moved past Rick toward the cell block entrance, his crutches clicking against the concrete floor. Behind him, he could hear Rick calling his name, could hear the sounds of the prison waking up as word spread that their war had finally arrived. Soon there would be weapons and arguments, and desperate plans that involved too much risk and too little hope. But first, there would be conversation. There would be an old man with a Bible walking toward a fence, betting everything on the possibility that even the most broken person could still choose to be something other than what their pain had made them. Herschel Green had lost his wife to cancer, his farm to walkers, his leg to survival, and his illusions to reality. But he still believed in the power of words to heal instead of harm. In a world that had forgotten the difference between strength and violence, he was about to test whether patience, properly applied, could still bear sweet fruit, even if the waiting killed him. Chapter 2. Across the Divide. 3 hours before the tank would roll up to the prison gates, Herschel Green was teaching Michonne how to burn the dead properly. Not the mechanical work of disposal, she'd mastered that months ago, but the quieter practice of bearing witness, of acknowledging that each corpse had been someone's daughter, someone's father, someone who'd had favorite songs and private fears before the fever took them. They worked in silence beyond the prison's outer fence, in the cleared zone where they'd been dumping the bodies from the flu outbreak that had nearly destroyed them from within. Herschel moved slowly between the pyres, his crutches finding purchase on ground that had been churned soft by repeated foot traffic. Michonne followed his rhythm, neither rushing ahead nor falling behind, her katana loose in its sheath, but ready, always ready. "The Cherokee have a saying," Herschel said, pausing beside a small pile of personal effects they'd removed before burning. Reading glasses, a wedding ring, a child's stuffed rabbit that someone had clutched even in death. That death is not the opposite of life, but the opposite of birth. Life continues. Michonne glanced at him, her expression unreadable. She wasn't much for philosophy, especially the kind that tried to find meaning in meaningless loss. But she'd learned to listen when Herschel talked about death. He'd buried more people than most, had made peace with mortality in ways that let him sleep at night. There was something to be learned from that kind of acceptance, even if she wasn't sure she wanted to learn it. "You think they're at peace?" she asked, gesturing toward the flames. "The ones who died from the sickness?" "I think they're not suffering anymore," Herschel replied. "Sometimes that's the best we can hope for." They might have continued working until sunset, might have finished their grim task, and returned to the prison with nothing more dramatic than dirty clothes and the lingering smell of smoke. But the sound of approaching vehicles cut through the autumn air, too close and moving too fast to be anyone they were expecting. Michonne's hand went to her sword automatically, her body shifting into the combat stance that had kept her alive since Atlanta fell. But Herschel remained still, listening to the engine noise with the practiced attention of a man who'd learned to read approaching danger by sound alone. Multiple vehicles, organized formation. Not walkers, then, and not random survivors desperate enough to risk an approach to an obviously defended position. "We should go," Michonne said quietly. "Now." Herschel nodded, but before he could reach for his crutches, the tree line erupted with movement. Armed figures emerging from cover they'd held with military discipline, positioning themselves to cut off retreat routes with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. At the center of it all, walking toward them with the unhurried confidence of a man who'd already won, came Philip Blake. The governor looked different than the last time they'd seen him. Thinner, greyer, wearing clothes that had seen too many nights sleeping rough. But his eyes held the same dangerous intensity, the same ability to project absolute authority, even when he had no actual power to back it up. He'd lost Woodbury, lost his army, lost everything except his capacity to convince others to follow him into darkness. And somehow, that had been enough to build a new group, to find new people willing to believe that he could keep them safe in a world that specialized in proving such promises false. "Herschel," the governor said by way of greeting, stopping just outside sword range. "Michonne." His voice carried no particular hostility, no obvious threat. He might have been encountering old neighbors at a grocery store, commenting on the weather. But his followers had them surrounded, weapons ready, and there was something in his stillness that spoke to barely contained violence. Michonne tensed, calculating distances and angles, weighing the possibility of fighting their way clear against the mathematics of being outnumbered 3-1. But Herschel placed a gentle hand on her arm, a gesture so subtle that the governor's people might have missed it, and she held her position, waiting. "Philip," Herschel said, and there was something almost gentle in the way he spoke the name. Not governor, not the title that had become synonymous with brutality and manipulation, but the name of the man who'd existed before grief had carved away everything soft in him. "You're looking well." The governor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He wasn't used to people addressing him as Philip anymore, wasn't comfortable with reminders of who he'd been before the world ended. "Can't say the same for you," he replied, glancing at Herschel's crutches. "That leg healing properly?" "Well enough." Herschel's voice remained conversational, as if they were discussing the weather rather than standing at the edge of violence. "Are your people hungry? We've got supplies back at the prison. Medical attention, if anyone needs it." The question seemed to catch the governor off guard. He'd come here prepared for resistance, for threats, for the usual posturing that preceded either surrender or slaughter. He wasn't prepared for an offer of humanitarian aid from the man he'd come to take prisoner. For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Confusion, perhaps, or something that might have been recognition of the man he'd once been. "We're not here for charity," he said finally, his voice regaining its practiced hardness. "We're here for the prison, for what's ours by right of strength." "And what gives us the right to it?" Herschel asked. "We didn't build those walls, we just found them. We cleared it, we made it safe, we earned it." "So did the men who built it originally," Herschel observed mildly. "So did the prisoners who died there. So did the guards who tried to keep order when everything fell apart. None of them have it now. What makes our claim any different?" The governor was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on Herschel's face, as if trying to solve a puzzle. This wasn't how these conversations were supposed to go. People were supposed to be afraid when he appeared with armed followers. They were supposed to plead or threaten or try to bargain from positions of weakness. They weren't supposed to engage in philosophical discussions about property rights in the apocalypse. "You're coming with us," he said finally, abandoning the conversational approach. "Both of you. We're going to have a discussion with your people about the future of this arrangement." Michonne shifted her weight, preparing to draw steel, but again, Herschel's gentle pressure on her arm held her back. "All right," he said simply. "But I'd like to finish here first. Give me a few minutes to see these people properly honored." The governor stared at him. "You want to finish burning the dead?" "Yes." "Before you come with me to negotiate the surrender of your community?" "Yes." The governor looked around at his followers, several of whom were exchanging confused glances. This wasn't how their leader usually conducted business. There were supposed to be threats, demonstrations of power, clear displays of who held the stronger position. But instead, their captive was asking for time to complete funeral rites, and their leader seemed genuinely unsure how to respond. "Why?" the governor asked finally. "Because they were people," Herschel said. "Because they deserve to be remembered as more than just bodies to be disposed of. Because in a world that's forgotten, the difference between human beings and obstacles to be removed, someone has to remember." The governor was quiet for a long moment, watching Herschel's face with an expression that might have been curiosity. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that might have been genuine interest. "You really believe that? That any of this matters anymore?" "I believe that what we choose to value in the worst moments defines who we really are," Herschel replied. "I believe that the moment we stop seeing the humanity in others, even in death, is the moment we lose our own." The governor gestured to his followers, who lowered their weapons slightly but remained ready. "Finish it then," he said, "but quickly." They worked in silence, Herschel and Michonne completing their task under the watchful eyes of armed strangers, while the governor stood apart, lost in thoughts he didn't share. When the last of the bodies had been consigned to flame, when the final prayer had been spoken over the anonymous dead, Herschel straightened slowly and met the governor's gaze. "Thank you," he said simply. The governor nodded curtly, but there was something different in his expression now, something that hadn't been there when he'd emerged from the trees with his followers. "Now we go," he said. During the ride back toward the prison, squeezed into the back of a pickup truck between two of the governor's followers, while Michonne rode in the cab up front, Herschel found himself studying their captors. They were scared, he realized. Not of immediate danger. They had the weapons, the numbers, the tactical advantage. But they were scared of tomorrow, of the day after, of the endless succession of choices and compromises that staying alive in this world demanded. They looked at their leader with the desperate hope of people who'd convinced themselves that someone else could carry the weight of deciding who lived and who died. "You're a veterinarian," the governor said suddenly from the driver's seat, his voice carrying clearly through the truck's rear window. It wasn't a question. "Was," Herschel replied. "Still am, I suppose. The skills don't go away just because the world changes. You ever have to put an animal down? Healthy animal that wasn't sick, wasn't suffering, but needed to die anyway?" Herschel considered the question, recognizing the weight behind it. "Yes," he said finally. "Sometimes." "How did you decide when it was necessary? When keeping it alive would cause more suffering than ending its life," Herschel said. "When there was no other way to protect others from harm. When it was genuinely the most merciful choice available." The governor was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, more distant. "I had a daughter," he said, "before. Penny. 7 years old. She loved animals. Wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up, just like you." Herschel felt something shift in the truck's atmosphere. Michonne had turned in the passenger seat to listen. Even the governor's followers seemed to recognize that their leader was sharing something he rarely spoke about, something that mattered in ways they didn't fully understand. "What happened to her?" Herschel asked gently. "She got sick. The fever. I kept her. I kept her after she died. Told myself I was protecting her, that I could find a way to bring her back. But really, I just couldn't let go." The governor's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "A friend of mine, he tried to explain to me that she wasn't my daughter anymore. That what I was keeping wasn't Penny, but something wearing her face. I killed him for it. The truck was silent, except for the rumble of the engine and the sound of tires on broken pavement. Herschel could see the back of the governor's head through the rear window, could watch the tension in his shoulders as he relived memories that had shaped him in ways he was still trying to understand. "Do you regret it?" Herschel asked finally. "Every day," the governor replied without hesitation. "But regret doesn't bring anyone back, doesn't change what happened, doesn't make the choices any easier going forward." "No," Herschel agreed. "But it can make us different. It can teach us to choose differently next time." The governor met his eyes in the rearview mirror. "You think there's a next time? You think any of us get to be different than what this world made us?" "I think we become what we choose to become," Herschel said. "The world gives us circumstances. We give them meaning." They were approaching the prison now, the familiar walls and watchtowers visible through the trees. Soon there would be confrontation, negotiation, the complex dance of violence and diplomacy that had become the standard method of resolving disputes between survivor communities. But for just a moment, sitting in the back of a truck with armed strangers while the governor drove them toward an uncertain future, Herschel felt something that might have been hope. Philip Blake was still capable of regret, still capable of questioning his own choices, of recognizing the cost of the path he'd taken. That meant he was still capable of choosing a different path. The question was whether anyone could find the words to show him what that path might look like. Herschel intended to try. Chapter 3. The Mirror of Loss. The tank made everything different. Not just the tactical situation, though the mathematics of survival had certainly shifted in favor of the people who'd brought an M1A1 Abrams to a fight against concrete walls and desperate families. But something deeper than strategy had changed the moment Philip Blake positioned himself behind 68 tons of American military engineering. The tank transformed him from a man making threats into a man keeping promises. It made every word that followed a matter of life and death rather than mere negotiation. Herschel could see it in the faces of his people as they assembled behind the prison's chain-link fence, Rick moving with the careful economy of a man conserving energy for violence. Darrell's crossbow already loaded, his eyes calculating angles and distances. Glenn positioned in the watchtower with a rifle he'd learned to use out of necessity rather than choice. These were good people who'd become soldiers because the world had given them no other option. They were prepared to die for each other, prepared to kill to protect the children sleeping in the cells behind them. But they weren't prepared for what Herschel was about to try. The governor stood beside his tank, like a man who'd finally found the prop that matched his performance. He'd spent months rebuilding his authority through charisma and manipulation, convincing new followers that he could provide the safety their old leaders had failed to deliver. The tank made that promise tangible. It said that Philip Blake had resources, connections, the kind of military hardware that only serious players possessed. It said that resistance was futile and negotiation was a courtesy he was extending out of mercy rather than weakness. "Rick," the governor called across the 50 yards of open ground that separated their communities. His voice carried the practiced authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I think it's time we had that conversation." Rick stepped forward to the fence, his hands empty but ready, his posture broadcasting the kind of coiled tension that preceded either surrender or slaughter. Behind him, the prison group held their positions, visible, armed, but not yet committed to any particular course of action. They were waiting to see what their leader would choose, whether he would find a way to save them that didn't require choosing which of them would die first. "I see you brought friends," Rick said, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "And party favors." The governor smiled, the expression sharp and humorless. Insurance, he replied, against misunderstandings. I'd hate for this conversation to be derailed by unrealistic assessments of relative strength. What do you want? The prison. Your supplies. Your weapons. The governor's voice remained conversational, as if he were discussing the weather rather than demanding everything they'd built. You can keep your lives. That's more generosity than most people get in this world. Rick's jaw worked, the visible sign of a man running through options and finding none of them acceptable. Surrender meant slow death through exposure and starvation. Resistance meant fast death through superior firepower. Either way, the children in the cells behind him would pay the price for his choices. This was the nightmare scenario every leader in the apocalypse eventually faced, the moment when all the careful preparation and defensive measures proved insufficient, when survival came down to choosing which unacceptable option was least catastrophic. I need time to consider, Rick began. No. Herschel's voice cut through the negotiation, like a blade through silk, clear and absolute. He moved forward on his crutches, past Rick, past the defensive line his people had established, directly toward the fence that separated him from 68 tons of American firepower. Philip, we need to talk. The governor's composure flickered. He'd expected Rick to plead or threaten or attempt to bargain from a position of weakness. He hadn't expected the old veterinarian to insert himself into military negotiations with the quiet authority of a man who believed words carried more weight than weapons. Herschel, he said, his voice losing some of its calculated menace. You're not in charge here. Neither are you, Herschel replied gently. He reached the fence and curled his fingers through the chain link, his eyes meeting the governor's across the divide. Not really. You're in charge of that tank, and those people who follow you, and the fear that's driving this whole situation. But you're not in charge of what happens next. None of us are. That's something we choose. The governor gestured to Martinez, who moved the tank's main gun slightly to track Herschel's position. The message was clear. Old man with strong opinions remained extremely killable, regardless of his philosophical insights. But something in the governor's expression suggested he was genuinely curious about where this conversation might lead. Choose, the governor said. You think this is a choice? You think I'm standing here with a tank because I enjoy making threats? I think you're standing here with a tank because you're afraid, Herschel said simply. I think you lost everything once, and you're determined not to lose everything again. I think you believe that taking what we've built is the only way to protect what you have left. The governor's face darkened. You don't know anything about what I've lost. I know more than you might think. Herschel shifted his weight on his crutches, the movement deliberate and unhurried. Behind him, he could feel the tension of his own people, Rick's barely controlled panic, Daryl's readiness to start shooting, the collective held breath of a community watching their moral leader gamble with all their lives. I buried my wife 23 years ago this October. Annette. Breast cancer. 47 years old. The governor blinked, clearly not expecting personal revelation in the middle of a military confrontation. I'm sorry for your loss. Are you? Or are you wondering what that has to do with 68 tons of steel and the conversation we're having right now? Herschel's voice remained gentle, but there was something unyielding beneath the courtesy. Because it has everything to do with it, Philip. Everything. The governor was quiet, his eyes fixed on Herschel's face, as if trying to decode a message written in a language he'd forgotten how to read. When Annette died, I did what you did, Herschel continued. I held on too tight. I kept her clothes in the closet, kept her coffee cup on the kitchen counter, kept talking to her picture like she might answer back. I turned our bedroom into a shrine, and our farm into a mausoleum. I was so afraid of losing her completely that I forgot how to live in the world she'd left behind. The governor's hands had tightened into fists, his body language broadcasting discomfort with this unexpected turn toward intimacy. But he didn't interrupt, didn't order Martinez to end the conversation with cannon fire. Something in Herschel's words had caught his attention in a way that tactical discussions never could. "What changed?" the governor asked finally, his voice quieter than it had been. "My daughter Maggie," Herschel said. "She was 16, furious at the world for taking her mother, furious at me for disappearing into grief. One night she cornered me in the barn and told me that mourning Annette had become more important to me than raising the children she'd left behind. She said Annette wouldn't recognize the man I'd become, wouldn't understand why I'd chosen to honor her death instead of celebrating the life we'd built together." Herschel paused, his fingers working against the chain-link fence as if testing its strength. Around them, the standoff continued, weapons trained, tank positioned, two communities balanced on the edge of violence. But the quality of attention had shifted. The governor's followers were watching their leader with the same intensity as the prison group, recognizing that something fundamental was happening in this conversation. "I went to her grave that night," Herschel continued, "talked to her headstone like I'd been doing every day for 2 years. But for the first time, I listened for an answer. Really listened. And what I heard, what I finally understood, was that keeping her alive in my grief was just another way of killing her. She wasn't in the bedroom shrine, or the coffee cup, or the photographs. She was in the lessons she'd taught our children, in the kindness she'd shown to strangers, in the love she'd given me that made me capable of loving others." The governor's jaw was working, his eyes distant with what might have been recognition. "Penny," he said quietly, "tell me about her." "She was—" The governor stopped, started again. "She was 7. She loved butterflies, used to catch them in mason jars and make me promise to let them go before bedtime because they needed to be free to find their families." His voice caught slightly. "She died in my arms. The fever. I held her while she burned up from the inside, and when she stopped breathing, I couldn't let go. Because letting go felt like losing her twice. Because letting go felt like betrayal." The governor's composure was cracking, years of carefully maintained authority dissolving under the weight of memories he'd buried beneath pragmatism and necessary violence. She was my little girl. She trusted me to protect her, and I failed. Keeping her afterward, it was the only way I could keep that promise. "But it wasn't her anymore, was it?" Herschel asked gently. "The thing you kept, the thing you protected. It wasn't Penny. It was your guilt wearing her face." The governor flinched as if he'd been struck. Martinez shifted uncomfortably beside the tank, clearly recognizing that his leader was venturing into emotional territory that might compromise their tactical position. The other followers exchanged glances, uncertain whether they should interrupt or let this unexpected confession continue. "When I finally accepted that walkers weren't our family members anymore," Herschel said, "when I finally understood that the thing wearing Annette's face wasn't my wife, but a predator using her form, that's when I started healing. Not from the loss, but from the infection. From the poison that comes from loving ghosts instead of honoring memory." The governor was shaking now, his carefully constructed facade dissolving entirely. "How?" he asked, the word barely audible. "How do you honor someone by letting them go?" "You live the life they would want you to live," Herschel said. "You become the person they believed you could be. You take the love they gave you and use it to protect others instead of yourself." He gestured behind him to the prison, to the community of survivors who'd become family. These people saved me from my grief, Philip. They gave me purpose beyond my loss. They taught me that healing others is the only way to heal yourself. The governor looked past Herschel to the faces watching from behind the fence. Rick, who'd lost a wife and found a way to keep leading. Darrell, who'd lost a brother and found a way to keep protecting others. Children who'd lost parents, but somehow still managed to smile, to play, to believe in tomorrow. A community that had turned a prison into a home, that had chosen to build something beautiful in a world dedicated to destruction. It's not too late, Herschel said quietly. It's never too late to choose differently. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the governor stood frozen between his tank and his past, between the promise of overwhelming force and the possibility of redemption. His followers watched him with growing uncertainty. The prison community held their breath, and Herschel waited, patient as a man who understood that some seeds took time to grow, that some conversations changed everything, even when they looked like nothing at all. When the governor finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know how to be anything other than what this world made me." "Neither did I," Herschel replied. "But I learned. We all learned. And if we can do it, so can you." The tank's engine idled. The sun tracked slowly across the autumn sky, and in the space between two communities balanced on the edge of war, an old man with a Bible and a broken father with a tank began the slow work of building a bridge across the divide. Chapter 4. Cracks in the armor. The moment stretched like a held breath between heartbeats. The governor's confession about Penny hung in the air between the two communities, raw and vulnerable in a way that made his followers shift uncomfortably behind their weapons. This wasn't the man who'd convinced them to follow him into battle against a fortified position. This wasn't the leader who'd promised them safety through strength, security through superior firepower. This was someone else, entirely. Someone who remembered what it felt like to lose everything and couldn't quite figure out how to stop losing it. Martinez cleared his throat, the sound sharp enough to cut through the emotional atmosphere that had settled over the standoff. "Governor," he said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man trying not to challenge authority, while still reminding everyone where that authority was supposed to lead. "We should probably—" "Should what?" The governor turned to face his lieutenant, and there was something different in his posture now. The rigid certainty that had characterized his leadership style had given way to something more tentative, more human. "Finish what we started. Take the prison by force. Kill these people for the crime of trying to survive in the same world we're surviving in?" Martinez blinked, clearly not expecting philosophical questions in the middle of a military operation. "We need the resources," he said carefully. "We need the security. You said so yourself." "I said a lot of things." The governor looked back at Herschel, who remained positioned at the fence like a bridge between two worlds that had forgotten how to coexist. "But maybe I was wrong about what we actually need." Behind the governor, his followers exchanged glances that spoke volumes about the fragility of leadership in the apocalypse. They'd chosen to follow Philip Blake because he projected absolute confidence, because he seemed to know exactly what needed to be done and how to do it. Uncertainty was a luxury they couldn't afford. Doubt was a weakness that got people killed. But now their leader was questioning the very foundation of the mission they'd risked everything to undertake. Herschel could see the moment crystallizing around them, the delicate balance between hope and catastrophe that made every word a potential catalyst for either salvation or slaughter. The governor was wavering, but his people weren't prepared to follow him into uncertainty. They needed concrete alternatives, practical solutions that addressed their fears without requiring them to abandon everything they'd been told about how survival worked. What if there was another way? Herschel asked quietly. What if instead of taking what we have, you shared what we have? What if instead of one community conquering another, we became something new together? The governor stared at him. You're suggesting integration, combining our groups? I'm suggesting cooperation, Herschel replied. You have people who need shelter, medical care, the kind of stability that comes from numbers and organization. We have infrastructure, established defenses, agricultural systems that could support a larger population with proper planning. Instead of fighting over limited resources, we could pool our resources and expand what's possible. The tank's engine continued to idle, a 68-ton reminder that this conversation was still taking place under the threat of overwhelming force. But something fundamental had shifted in the quality of attention surrounding it. The governor's followers were listening now, not just to their leader, but to the alternative being proposed. The prison community behind Herschel had lowered their weapons slightly, recognizing that their moral leader was attempting something unprecedented. They'll never accept it, the governor said finally, gesturing toward his own people. They've followed me this far because I convinced them that taking the prison was the only way to guarantee their safety. They believe in strength, in the kind of certainty that comes from eliminating potential threats before those threats can eliminate them. And what do you believe? Herschel asked. The governor was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant with what might have been memory or possibility. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been wonder. I used to believe in community, he said slowly. Before Woodbury fell, before I understood what it cost to keep people safe. I believed that civilization was something we could rebuild, that leadership meant protecting people from the world instead of protecting them from each other. He paused, looking around at the assembled communities, his own followers armed and ready for battle, the prison group prepared for siege, children's faces visible through barred windows behind the fence. But this world teaches you that kindness is weakness, that mercy is suicide, that the only way to protect what you love is to destroy what threatens it. I learned those lessons well. Maybe too well. From behind the tank, a woman stepped forward. Lily, one of the newer members of the governor's group, someone who'd joined them after Woodbury's fall, and had never quite shed the skepticism that came from surviving multiple failed communities. She moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to weighing risks, someone who'd learned to think for herself when following others had proved unreliable. Governor, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the standoff. Can I ask you something? The governor nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with public questioning of his judgment. When you recruited us, Lily continued, when you convinced us to follow you here, you told us that these people had taken something that belonged to us, that they were a threat that had to be eliminated for our own survival. But looking at them now, she gestured toward the prison group, toward the children visible through the windows, toward the community garden visible through the fence. They don't look like conquerors. They look like a family. The governor's jaw worked, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Appearances can be deceiving. So can leaders, Lily replied quietly. I followed Martinez before I followed you. I followed the camp coordinator before I followed Martinez. I've learned to recognize when someone's asking me to risk my life for their vision instead of our survival. The words hit the governor like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of the authority he'd built through charisma and manipulation. His followers were watching him now, with the kind of careful attention that preceded either renewed loyalty or outright rebellion. They were evaluating his leadership in real time, weighing his judgment against the evidence of their own eyes. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "I'm suggesting we listen to what the old man is proposing," Lily said. "I'm suggesting we consider whether taking this place by force is actually necessary, or whether it's just what we've convinced ourselves is necessary because force is what we know." The governor looked around at his other followers, reading the expressions on their faces with the practiced eye of someone who'd built his power base through understanding what people wanted to hear. What he saw there wasn't encouraging. Doubt, uncertainty, the kind of questions that undermined absolute authority and made room for alternative possibilities. "You want to know what I really believe?" the governor said finally, his voice barely audible above the tank's engine. "I believe I've been dreaming about Penny every night since she died. I believe I wake up in a cold sweat because I can't remember the sound of her laugh anymore, can't picture her face without seeing the walker she became. I believe I've been carrying around her death like a weight that's gotten heavier every day, and I've been so afraid of letting go that I forgot how to carry anything else." The confession hung in the air like smoke, visible and inescapable. Herschel could see Rick shifting behind the fence, torn between hope for a peaceful resolution and preparation for the violence that might still come. Darrell remained positioned with his crossbow, ready for either possibility. The prison children continued to watch through windows, their presence a reminder of what was actually at stake in this conversation. "Grief doesn't have to be a weapon," Herschel said gently. "Loss doesn't have to define everything that comes after it. I learned that from these people, from this community. They taught me that healing others is the only way to heal yourself, that protecting others is the only way to honor the people you couldn't protect." The governor was shaking now, years of carefully maintained composure finally giving way to the emotional reality he'd been avoiding. "I don't know how to be anything other than what this world made me," he said, the words barely a whisper. "Neither did I," Herschel replied. "But I learned. We all learned. And if you're willing to try, we can teach you too." Martinez stepped forward, his expression concerned. "Governor, the men are getting restless. They need to know what we're doing here. Are we taking the prison or not?" The governor looked at his lieutenant, at the tank, at the weapons arrayed behind him. Then he looked at Herschel, at the prison community, at the children watching through windows who represented either future victims or future family depending on what choice he made in the next few moments. "Stand down," he said quietly. Martinez blinked. "Sir?" "Stand down," the governor repeated, his voice gaining strength. "Lower your weapons. Turn off the tank. We're not taking the prison by force today." "Then what are we doing?" The governor met Herschel's eyes across the fence, and for just a moment, the weight of years of violence and loss seemed to lift from his shoulders. "We're trying something different," he said. "We're learning what cooperation looks like." From behind the prison fence, Rick stepped forward, his expression cautious but hopeful. "You're serious about this? About working together?" "I'm serious about trying," the governor replied. "I'm serious about finding out whether my daughter would recognize the man I've become. And if she wouldn't, I'm serious about becoming someone she would be proud of." The tank's engine finally shut down, the sudden silence almost deafening after hours of mechanical rumble. In that silence, two communities stood on opposite sides of a fence, no longer enemies, but not yet allies, balanced on the edge of something unprecedented. They were about to discover whether redemption was possible in a world that specialized in proving such hope foolish. But for the first time in months, Philip Blake was willing to find out. For the first time since Penny's death, He was ready to choose hope over fear, healing over harm, building over destroying. It might have been too late for salvation, but it wasn't too late to try. Chapter 5. The Moment of Truth. The sword appeared in the governor's hands like an extension of his grief, Michonne's katana catching the late afternoon sun as he drew it from its sheath with the practiced motion of a man who'd learned to make death look elegant. The conversation had reached its natural conclusion. Words had been exchanged, positions had been clarified, alternatives had been proposed and considered. But in the end, this was still the apocalypse, and the apocalypse had its own logic, its own requirements, its own insistence that some problems could only be solved through violence. Herschel felt the weight of the moment settling around him like a shroud. Everything they'd discussed, every psychological breakthrough, every moment of connection and understanding, it all came down to this. The governor's hand on the sword, the blade's edge catching light as it moved toward his throat, the absolute silence that had fallen over both communities as they watched their leaders navigate the space between conversation and execution. "This is how it has to be," the governor said, but his voice lacked conviction. The sword trembled slightly in his grip, betraying the internal war being fought behind his composed exterior. "You understand that, don't you, Herschel? This is how these things end." Herschel met his eyes and smiled, the expression so unexpected in the face of imminent death that several of the governor's followers actually stepped backward. It wasn't the desperate grin of a man trying to charm his way out of execution, wasn't the bitter rictus of someone accepting inevitable defeat. It was the gentle, patient smile of a teacher watching a student work through a difficult problem, confident that the right answer would eventually emerge. "Is it?" Herschel asked quietly. "Is this really how it has to end, Philip?" The governor's jaw tightened at the use of his real name, the identity he'd tried so hard to bury beneath titles and authority, and the kind of necessary ruthlessness that kept people alive in a world designed to kill them. The sword pressed closer to Herschel's throat, sharp enough that a single quick motion would open arteries and end conversations forever. "You think you can talk your way out of this?" the governor asked. But there was something hollow in his voice, something that suggested he was asking the question of himself as much as of his intended victim. "I'm not trying to talk my way out of anything," Herschel replied calmly. "I'm trying to talk you into something, into the possibility that strength doesn't have to mean violence, that leadership doesn't have to mean choosing who lives and who dies, that protecting the people you love doesn't have to mean destroying the people who might love them too." Behind the fence, Rick's hand had moved to his weapon, his face a mask of barely controlled panic as he watched his community's moral center balanced on the edge of a blade. Darrell had his crossbow raised, finger on the trigger, waiting for the moment when talking stopped and shooting became the only language that mattered. The entire prison group was poised between hope and horror, trusting Herschel's wisdom while preparing for the possibility that wisdom might not be enough. "You want to know about strength?" the governor said, pressing the katana's edge against Herschel's skin hard enough to draw a thin line of blood. "You want to know about leadership? I led Woodbury for months. I kept 73 people alive in a world that kills 74 out of 75. I made the hard choices, did the necessary things, sacrificed my own humanity so they could keep theirs. And where did it get me?" "Here," Herschel said simply. "It got you here, to this moment, with that sword at my throat, trying to decide whether the man your daughter loved is worth saving, or whether the monster this world created is all that's left." The governor's hand trembled more violently now, the katana's point wavering as decades of accumulated pain and rage warred with something that might have been hope. Around them, the standoff continued in perfect silence, two communities watching their leaders negotiate the terms of either cooperation or catastrophe. "You think Penny would want this?" Herschel continued, his voice remaining gentle despite the steel at his throat. "You think she'd want her father to become the kind of man who solves problems by cutting throats? You think she'd recognize the person you've become, or would she be afraid of the stranger wearing her daddy's face?" "Don't!" The word came out as a growl, raw and dangerous. "Don't use her against me." "I'm not using her against you," Herschel replied. "I'm using her for you. I'm asking you to remember who you were when she was alive, who you wanted to be when you tucked her into bed at night and promised her the world would be safe in the morning. I'm asking you to honor her memory by choosing to be that man again." The governor's composure was cracking completely now, tears streaming down his face as the sword shook in his grip. The performance of authority that had sustained him through months of leadership was dissolving under the weight of genuine emotion, leaving behind only the broken father who'd never learned how to grieve properly. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't be that man anymore. This world took him away. This world killed him along with everyone else I loved." "No," Herschel said firmly. "This world challenged him. This world tested him. But it didn't kill him unless you let it. Unless you choose to let it." From somewhere behind the governor, Michonne's voice cut through the emotional atmosphere like a blade of its own. "He's right," she said, stepping forward despite the weapons trained on her by the governor's followers. "I know what it's like to lose everything. I know what it's like to let that loss turn you into something you don't recognize. But I also know what it's like to find your way back." The governor turned slightly to look at her, the katana still pressed against Herschel's throat, but his attention momentarily diverted. Michonne moved closer, her hands empty, her posture non-threatening, despite being the owner of the weapon currently being used to threaten execution. "That's my sword," she said quietly. "I've killed people with it. Good people. Bad people. People who were just trying to survive same as me. I've used it to protect what I love and destroy what I fear. But you know what I learned?" The governor waited, his breathing ragged with suppressed emotion. "I learned that every time I used it to solve a problem through violence, I created two more problems that could only be solved the same way. I learned that the person who picks up a sword to protect what she loves eventually becomes someone who can only love things she can protect with a sword." Michonne's eyes met Herschel's across the blade. "But this man taught me something different. He taught me that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is put the weapon down." The governor stared at her for a long moment, then looked back at Herschel, who waited patiently for the next words to come. The old veterinarian's calm acceptance of his situation, his refusal to plead or threaten or bargain for his life, was more unsettling than any show of defiance could have been. It suggested a man who'd made peace with mortality without giving up on possibility, who could face death without losing faith in life. "What if you're wrong?" the governor asked finally. "What if I put this sword down and your people kill me anyway? What if cooperation is just another word for conquest, and trust is just another word for suicide? Then you'll die knowing you chose to be the man your daughter loved instead of the monster your pain created," Herschel replied. "You'll die as Philip Blake, father and protector, instead of as the governor, dealer in necessary deaths. And if that's how it ends, at least it ends with your humanity intact." The governor looked around at his followers, reading the expressions on their faces as they watched their leader navigate the space between violence and vulnerability. What he saw there wasn't the bloodlust he'd expected, wasn't the eager anticipation of conquest and revenge. Instead, he saw uncertainty, fear, and something that might have been relief. These people had followed him, not because they wanted to kill, but because they wanted to live. If there was another way to achieve that goal, a way that didn't require turning children into orphans and fathers into corpses, they were ready to consider it. "I'm tired," the governor said suddenly, the words carrying the weight of months of sleepless nights and impossible choices. "I'm so fucking tired of being the person who decides who lives and who dies. I'm tired of carrying around everyone else's survival, like it's my personal responsibility. I'm tired of being strong when what I really want is to just stop." "Then stop," Herschel said simply. "Put down the sword. Put down the burden. Let someone else carry the weight for a while." The katana trembled in the governor's hands, its blade still pressed against Herschel's throat, but with less pressure now, less certainty. Around them, the world held its breath. Two communities balanced on the edge of transformation, waiting to see whether redemption was possible or whether some people had traveled too far into darkness to find their way back to light. "If I do this," the governor said finally, "if I put down the sword and trust you to keep your word about cooperation, what happens to the people who followed me here? What happens to them if this goes wrong?" "They become part of our family," Herschel replied without hesitation. "They become people we protect instead of people we fight. They become part of the community we're all trying to build. And if some of them can't accept that, if some of them would rather fight than cooperate, then we'll deal with that problem when it arises," Herschel said. "Together, as a community. The way these problems are supposed to be solved." The governor closed his eyes, and for a moment his face was transformed, the hard lines of authority and necessary cruelty softening into something that might have been peace. When he opened them again, Herschel could see Philip Blake looking back at him, the man who'd existed before grief and responsibility and the weight of other people's survival had carved away everything gentle in him. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay." The sword fell from his hand, clattering against the concrete as the governor, as Philip Blake, sank to his knees before Herschel, his shoulders shaking with the force of emotions too long suppressed. Around them, weapons lowered, tensions eased, and two communities that had been preparing for war found themselves instead preparing for something unprecedented. The possibility that different didn't have to mean enemy, that survival didn't have to mean conquest, that the future could be built on cooperation instead of corpses. In the sudden silence that followed, with the katana lying abandoned on the ground and its former wielder weeping at the feet of the man he'd almost killed, Herschel Green smiled again, not with triumph. There were no winners or losers in this moment, only human beings choosing to be human together. But with hope, with the quiet satisfaction of a teacher who'd watched a difficult student finally understand the lesson. The sun was setting over the prison walls, painting everything in shades of gold and possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new problems to solve, new tests of whether cooperation could actually work in a world designed to pit people against each other. But tonight, for the first time in months, both communities would sleep without the weight of impending war pressing down on their dreams. It was a beginning, small, fragile, uncertain, but a beginning nonetheless. And sometimes, Herschel reflected, as he reached down to help Philip Blake to his feet, beginnings were the most precious things of all. Chapter 6. After the storm. The silence that followed the dropping of the sword was unlike anything anyone present had experienced before. It wasn't the quiet of anticipation before battle, wasn't the held breath of people waiting for violence to begin. It was something entirely different, the profound hush that settles over a world when fundamental assumptions have been challenged and found wanting, when the expected script has been torn up, and everyone involved has to improvise their way toward an uncertain future. Philip Blake, he'd asked to be called Philip again, quietly, almost apologetically, as if reclaiming his own name was a privilege he wasn't sure he deserved, sat on the ground where he'd fallen, Michonne's katana lying forgotten beside him like an artifact from a war that had ended before it truly began. Around him, his followers stood in various states of confusion and relief, weapons lowered but not holstered, uncertain whether they were now prisoners, guests, or something entirely unprecedented in their experience of how these situations typically resolved. Rick Grimes moved like a man walking through a minefield, each step carefully considered, each gesture measured against the possibility that this fragile piece might shatter at any moment. He'd opened the prison gates, an act that would have been unthinkable an hour earlier, but his hand remained close to his weapon, and his eyes never stopped cataloguing escape routes and defensive positions. Trust, he'd learned, was a luxury that got people killed. But so was the kind of paranoia that made cooperation impossible. Finding the balance between those two truths was proving more complicated than anyone had anticipated. "We'll need to establish some ground rules," Rick said, addressing both communities but looking primarily at Herschel, who had somehow become the de facto mediator in negotiations between former enemies. Sleeping arrangements, work details, security protocols. We can't just throw everyone together and hope for the best. Herschel nodded, leaning heavily on his crutches as the emotional intensity of the past few hours began to take its physical toll. Agreed. This needs to be structured, intentional. Both groups need to feel safe while we figure out what cooperation actually looks like in practice. From behind Rick, Glenn stepped forward, his face tight with the kind of controlled anger that came from watching someone threaten the life of a man he'd come to view as a grandfather figure. "With respect, Herschel, these people came here with a tank. They were ready to kill all of us an hour ago. Now, we're supposed to trust them with access to our food, our weapons, our children." The question hung in the air like smoke, acrid and inescapable. It was the obvious question, the practical question, the question that everyone was thinking, but only Glenn had been willing to voice. Trust was easy to talk about in abstract terms, much harder to implement when it meant sleeping in the same building as people who'd recently been pointing guns at your family. Maggie moved to stand beside her husband, her expression equally skeptical. "Glenn's right. I want to believe this can work. I do. But wanting something doesn't make it safe. These people have been following him," she gestured toward Philip, "because he convinced them that taking our home by force was justified. What happens when some of them decide that cooperation isn't working fast enough? What happens when they remember that they outnumber us?" Philip looked up from where he sat, his face drawn with exhaustion and something that might have been shame. "They're right to be concerned," he said quietly. "I spent months teaching these people that survival meant taking what you needed from whoever was weak enough to lose it. I convinced them that mercy was suicide, that compromise was weakness. You can't undo that kind of conditioning with a single conversation." Martinez shifted uncomfortably near the disabled tank, clearly struggling with his own questions about what had just happened and what it meant for the people who'd followed his leader into this impossible situation. "Governor. Philip, what are we doing here? What do we tell the people who stayed back at the camp? They're expecting us to return with a new base, not whatever this is." "We tell them the truth," Philip replied, pulling himself slowly to his feet with the careful movements of a man who felt much older than his years. We tell them that we found something better than conquest. We found the possibility of building something together instead of taking something apart. Darrell had been notably quiet during the initial discussions, observing the dynamics between the groups with the hunter's instinct that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. Now he stepped forward, his crossbow slung across his back, but his posture still radiating the coiled readiness that defined his approach to potential threats. "Martinez, right?" he said, addressing the governor's lieutenant directly. "You know this area? Know the walker patterns, the safe routes, where the supplies are?" Martinez nodded cautiously, unsure where this line of inquiry was leading. "Some. We've been ranging pretty wide, looking for resources, mapping what's left of the infrastructure." "Good. We're going to need to expand our security perimeter if we're housing this many people. You know what kind of manpower we're working with, what kind of weapons?" The conversation that followed was purely practical. Logistics and tactics, numbers and capabilities, the mundane details that would determine whether idealistic cooperation could survive contact with apocalyptic reality. But there was something significant in the fact that it was happening at all. Darrell and Martinez discussing security protocols like colleagues rather than enemies, two professional survivors finding common ground in their shared understanding of what it took to keep people alive. Carl had been watching from the edge of the group, his young face cycling through expressions that spoke to the complexity of trying to process adult decisions through an adolescent understanding of morality and justice. Finally, he approached his father, his question pitched low enough that only Rick and the people immediately around them could hear. "Dad, how do you forgive someone who tried to kill your family?" Rick looked down at his son, seeing in Carl's eyes the same struggle he was experiencing himself. The boy had grown up too fast in this world, had been forced to make decisions and understand concepts that no child should have to grapple with. But he'd also learned lessons about survival and humanity that might be crucial for navigating this unprecedented situation. "I don't know if you do," Rick said honestly. "I don't know if forgiveness is something you can just decide to feel. But I think maybe the question isn't whether we can forgive them for what they were planning to do. Maybe the question is whether we can trust them to be different than what they were planning to be." Carl considered this, his expression serious beyond his years. "Do you think people can really change? Like, really change, not just pretend until they get what they want?" "I think people can choose to change," Rick replied carefully. "Whether they follow through on that choice, that's something we'll have to find out together." Behind them, Herschel was already at work, trying to bridge the practical gaps between theory and implementation. He'd gathered representatives from both groups, Carol and Glenn from the prison community, Lily and Martinez from Philip's followers, and was walking them through the logistics of integration. "We'll start with separate sleeping areas," he was saying, his voice carrying the patient authority of a man accustomed to mediating between competing interests. "Cell Block C has been cleared but not yet occupied. Philip's people can establish themselves there while we work through the details of shared resources and responsibilities." Carol nodded, but her expression remained skeptical. "What about meals, supplies? Are we pooling everything, or maintaining separate inventories?" "Pooled resources, shared responsibilities," Herschel replied, "but with oversight from both groups. Lily, would you be willing to work with Carol on establishing fair distribution protocols?" Lily stepped forward, her demeanor suggesting someone who'd learned to be cautious about new arrangements, but was willing to try if it meant genuine safety for the people she cared about. "I can do that. But my people are going to have questions. They're going to want to know what happens if this doesn't work out. What guarantees they have that cooperation won't turn into exploitation? The same guarantees we have, Carol said, her tone sharper than probably intended. None. We're all making the same bet here, that working together is safer than working against each other. But if it turns out we're wrong, we're all equally screwed. The bluntness of the statement seemed to paradoxically ease some of the tension in the group. There was something reassuring about acknowledged uncertainty, about the admission that no one really knew what they were doing or whether it would work. It meant that both communities were entering this arrangement from positions of genuine vulnerability rather than one trying to manipulate the other. Philip had remained largely silent during these discussions, standing apart from both groups like a man who wasn't sure which community he belonged to anymore. His followers looked to him occasionally, seeking guidance or reassurance, but he seemed lost in thoughts, too heavy to share. Finally, Herschel approached him, moving slowly on his crutches, his expression compassionate but determined. "Philip," he said quietly, "you're being awfully quiet for someone who's supposed to be helping lead this transition." Philip looked up, his eyes haunted. "I keep thinking about the things I've done, the people I've hurt, the choices I made that led us to this point. How do you build something good on a foundation like that? You acknowledge what came before without letting it define what comes next," Herschel replied. "You take responsibility for your past without allowing it to dictate your future. You accept that redemption is something you earn through actions, not something you receive through absolution. And if my people can't accept this arrangement, if some of them decide they'd rather fight than cooperate, then we deal with that problem when it arises," Herschel said. "Together, as a community. But we don't sabotage the possibility of cooperation by planning for its failure." The sun was setting now, painting the prison walls in shades of gold and amber that made everything look softer than it actually was. Both communities were beginning the slow process of settling in for the night, the first night they'd spend as reluctant neighbors rather than mortal enemies. There would be sentries posted, of course, and weapons within easy reach. Trust might be the goal, but verification would be the method. As the groups began to separate into their designated areas, Lily lingered near the fence where the confrontation had taken place. The abandoned tank sat silent nearby, its engine cold, its threat neutralized, but its presence still a reminder of how close they'd all come to tragedy. She was joined after a moment by Darrell, who seemed to be making his own assessment of the day's unprecedented events. "You think this is going to work?" she asked him, gesturing toward the two communities beginning the delicate process of coexistence. Darrell shrugged, his expression characteristically non-committal. "Don't know. Never seen anything like it before. But I've seen what happens when people give up on finding better ways to live together. Seen what the world looks like when everyone decides that force is the only language anybody speaks." He paused, watching as Philip helped some of his followers unload supplies from their vehicles, working alongside people who'd been ready to follow him into battle just hours earlier. Maybe it's worth finding out if there's another way. Maybe Herschel's right that some things are worth risking everything for, even if it gets people killed. "Especially if it gets people killed," Darrell replied, "because if we can't figure out how to live together, we're all gonna die alone anyway. At least this way, we die trying to be better than what the world expects us to be." As darkness settled over the prison, both communities began the careful work of learning to be neighbors. It wouldn't be easy. There would be conflicts, misunderstandings, moments when old instincts toward violence would reassert themselves. But for the first time since the world ended, a group of survivors was attempting something that had seemed impossible, choosing cooperation over conquest, building instead of taking, proving that humanity could be something more than just another predator species competing for limited resources. Whether it would work remained to be seen, but the fact that it was being attempted at all felt like a victory of sorts, a small light against the darkness of a world that had forgotten the difference between strength and brutality. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of whether idealism could survive contact with reality. But tonight, for the first time in months, both communities would sleep without the weight of impending war pressing down on their dreams. It was, as Herschel had said, a beginning, small, fragile, uncertain, but a beginning nonetheless. Chapter 7. Building Bridges. 3 weeks after the sword fell silent in the Georgia dirt, the prison looked like a different place entirely. Not because the walls had changed or the watchtowers had been rebuilt, but because the rhythm of daily life had shifted from the careful choreography of survival to something that almost resembled normalcy, the kind of normalcy that came from people working together toward common goals instead of constantly watching each other for signs of betrayal. The transformation was most visible in cell block C, which had gone from an empty concrete shell to something resembling a neighborhood. Philip's people had settled in with the methodical efficiency of survivors who'd learned not to waste time or energy on unnecessary decoration, but small touches of humanity had begun to appear anyway. Hand-drawn pictures from the children tucked between the bars. A small vegetable garden started in one of the window boxes, the sound of quiet conversation drifting through the hallways in the evening. But the real changes weren't architectural. They were in the way Martinez and Darrell now worked together to plan security rotations, their initial wariness having evolved into something approaching professional respect. In the way Lily had become Carol's unofficial second-in-command when it came to resource management, their shared pragmatism bridging the gap between former enemies. In the way Philip Blake, he'd asked everyone to call him Philip now, though some still slipped and used his old title, had thrown himself into physical labor with the desperate intensity of a man trying to build redemption, one concrete block at a time. Herschel watched these changes with the satisfaction of a gardener seeing seeds take root in previously barren soil. The integration hadn't been without its challenges. There had been arguments about resource allocation, conflicts over work assignments, moments when old suspicions flared into open hostility. But each crisis had been weathered, each problem had been solved, and gradually the two communities had begun to function as something approaching a single unit. The morning found him in the prison's makeshift therapy circle, an informal gathering that had started when one of Philip's followers, a young woman named Tara, who'd lost her sister to walkers just before joining the group, had broken down during a meal and been unable to stop crying. What had begun as an emergency intervention had evolved into a weekly session where anyone who needed to talk about loss, trauma, or the weight of impossible choices could find people willing to listen without judgment. The thing about nightmares, Philip was saying to the circle of faces gathered around him, is that they don't really go away. You just learn to recognize them for what they are. Echoes of things that already happened, not predictions of things that will happen. But knowing that and feeling it are different things entirely. Tara nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I keep dreaming that Lily's still alive, that she's trapped somewhere and calling for help and I can't find her. I wake up thinking I can still hear her voice. How long has it been? Asked Carol, who'd become one of the more regular participants, despite her initial skepticism about group discussion of private trauma. 4 months. But it feels like yesterday and forever at the same time. Herschel leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle. Grief doesn't follow a schedule, Tara. There's no timeline for healing, no deadline after which you're supposed to be over it. The goal isn't to stop missing your sister. The goal is to learn how to carry that missing without letting it crush you. From across the circle, Michonne spoke up. I lost my son before all this started. Car accident. For a long time, I thought the only way to honor his memory was to stay angry, to keep the pain fresh so I wouldn't forget him. But pain isn't the same thing as love. You can remember someone without reliving their death over and over. The conversation continued for another hour, touching on losses both recent and ancient, fears both specific and existential. When the session finally ended, people dispersed slowly, reluctant to break the spell of shared vulnerability that made these gatherings feel sacred in a way that formal religious services somehow couldn't match. Philip lingered after the others had gone, helping Herschel arrange the chairs back into their storage configuration. Thank you, he said quietly, for letting me be part of this, for trusting me with people's stories. Trust is something you earn, Herschel replied, testing the weight on his crutches as he prepared to move to his next obligation. And you're earning it, not through grand gestures, but through showing up, through listening, through being present when people need presence. They walked together toward the prison yard where the day's major project was taking place. The community had decided to expand the agricultural area, clearing and preparing additional space for crops that would be needed to feed the combined population through the coming winter. It was backbreaking work, hauling rocks, tilling hard-panned soil, building irrigation channels from salvaged materials. But it was work that brought people together in ways that formal integration exercises never could. Beth Green was teaching a group of mixed children near the new garden plots, her clear voice carrying across the work area as she led them through a lesson on plant biology that was both educational and immediately practical. The children ranged in age from 6 to 14, some from the original prison group and others from Philip's community. All of them focused on learning how seeds became food through the application of knowledge and patience. Plants need 3 things to grow, Beth was saying, holding up a handful of seeds that would eventually become tomatoes. Good soil, clean water, and time. You can't rush growth. You can't force it. You can only create the right conditions and trust the process. Philip paused to watch the lesson, his expression unreadable. One of the children, a boy named Luke, who'd joined the group with his grandmother, was struggling with the fine motor control required to plant seeds at the proper spacing. Without being asked, Philip knelt beside the boy and guided his hands, showing him how to measure distances with his fingers, how to press seeds into soil at just the right depth. Like this? Luke asked, his small face serious with concentration. Exactly like that, Philip replied. Plants are patient. They don't mind if you make mistakes while you're learning. They just need you to care enough to try. The moment was small, almost insignificant in the larger context of community integration and survivor politics. But Herschel recognized its importance. The way Philip's natural gentleness with children had reasserted itself, the way the boy had accepted guidance without fear or suspicion, the way Beth had smiled at the interaction instead of intervening protectively. These were the building blocks of genuine community, the small moments of trust and cooperation that made larger collaborations possible. Later that afternoon, during the supply run that had become a weekly necessity for the expanded community, the value of integration became even more apparent. The team consisted of both prison veterans and Philip's people, their combined knowledge of the local area and resource locations making them far more effective than either group could have been operating alone. Darrell and Martinez had developed an almost telepathic coordination when it came to clearing buildings and securing supplies. Martinez would identify potential walker hotspots based on his knowledge of the area's pre-apocalypse population density, while Darrell would assess structural integrity and escape routes with the instincts of someone who'd spent years learning to read danger in architectural details. "Building on the left has been picked clean already," Martinez was saying as they approached a strip mall that had once anchored a suburban commercial district. "But there's a medical supply store on the far end that we never got to. Should have antibiotics, surgical supplies, maybe some of the chronic medications Herschel's been looking for." "Approaches?" Darrell asked, already calculating angles and potential problems. "Front entrance is compromised. Glass is all blown out. Too much exposure. But there's a service entrance in the back, connects to a delivery alley that runs behind the whole strip. Clear sight lines, multiple exit routes if things go bad." They moved through the building with the kind of coordinated efficiency that took months to develop, each person understanding their role without need for explicit instruction. Glenn and Maggie worked together to clear the main retail space, while Michonne positioned herself at the entrance as both guard and early warning system. Philip and one of his followers, a man named Alden who'd proven particularly good at identifying valuable medical supplies, methodically worked through the pharmacy section, sorting medications by type and expiration date. It was during the extraction that the value of Philip's transformation became most apparent. They were loading the final boxes into their vehicles when Luke's grandmother, who'd insisted on joining the supply run despite her age, slipped on loose gravel and twisted her ankle badly enough that she couldn't put weight on it. The team was discussing how to safely transport her when a small group of walkers emerged from the tree line, drawn by the noise of their conversation. Philip reacted without hesitation, placing himself between the walkers and the injured woman while the others moved to engage the threat. But instead of drawing a weapon, he began making noise, clapping his hands, shouting, drawing the walker's attention away from the vulnerable civilian and toward himself. It was a tactical decision that prioritized protection over elimination, that demonstrated the kind of selfless courage that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with the choice to shield others from harm. The walkers were dispatched quickly by the rest of the team, but the moment lingered in everyone's memory during the drive back to the prison. Philip Blake had risked his own life to protect someone else's grandmother, had chosen self-sacrifice over self-preservation in a split-second decision that revealed the man he was becoming more clearly than any amount of therapy or group discussion could have accomplished. That evening, as had become tradition, both communities gathered for dinner in the prison's main cafeteria. The meal was simple: vegetables from their garden, meat from successful hunting expeditions, bread baked from carefully rationed flour, but it was shared. People sat wherever they found space. Conversations crossed group lines. Children played together regardless of which community their parents had originally belonged to. Herschel found himself at a table with Philip, Michonne, and several others, watching the social dynamics play out with the satisfaction of a man seeing his deepest beliefs about human nature proven correct. Near the kitchen area, Carol and Lily were planning the next week's meal schedule, their collaboration so natural now that it was hard to remember they'd once been on opposite sides of a potential war. At another table, Martinez was teaching Carl the basics of map reading, their heads bent together over hand-drawn diagrams of the surrounding area. "You know what I realized today?" Philip said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only their table could hear. "I spent so long trying to be strong enough to protect everyone that I forgot the point was to create a world worth protecting them for. This," he gestured around the cafeteria, taking in the sight of former enemies sharing meals and stories. "This is what I should have been building all along." Michonne studied his face with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read people for signs of deception or instability. "What changed?" she asked. What made the difference between the man who held a sword to Herschel's throat and the man who threw himself between Walker's and Luke's grandmother? Philip was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think I stopped trying to control outcomes and started trying to deserve them," he said finally. "I stopped asking what I could take to keep my people safe, and started asking what I could give to make everyone safer. It's a small shift, but it changes everything." As the evening wound down and people began drifting toward their respective sleeping areas, Herschel remained in the cafeteria with a cup of coffee that had been carefully hoarded for special occasions. Through the windows, he could see the lights of the watchtowers where mixed security teams maintained their vigilance against external threats. In the distance, the sound of quiet conversation and laughter drifted from both cell blocks, the natural sounds of a community settling in for the night. 3 weeks ago, this prison had been a fortress under siege, its inhabitants preparing for war against an enemy determined to take everything they'd built. Tonight, it was home to 137 people who'd learned to see each other as family instead of threats, who'd chosen cooperation over conquest, who'd proven that redemption was possible even in a world that specialized in making people forget their own humanity. It wasn't perfect. There were still tensions, still moments when old suspicions resurfaced, still individuals on both sides who struggled with the transition from enemies to neighbors. But it was working. Slowly, carefully, one small act of trust at a time. 2 broken communities had become something new and stronger than either could have been alone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of whether their fragile cooperation could survive the pressures that had destroyed so many other attempts at civilization. But tonight, for the first time since the world ended, Herschel Green fell asleep in a community where the strongest people were those who chose to build instead of destroy, to heal instead of harm, to prove that humanity could be something more than just another predator species fighting over scraps of a dead world. It was, he thought, as sleep finally claimed him, exactly what Dale would have wanted. Exactly what Penny Blake would have been proud to see her father become. Exactly what the world needed, if it was ever going to remember how to be a world worth living in. Chapter 8. The Test of Faith. The Walker herd appeared on the horizon like a storm front, a dark mass moving across the Georgia landscape with the inexorable persistence of a natural disaster. From the watchtower where he'd been conducting the morning security briefing, Darrell could see them through his binoculars. Thousands of corpses shambling in loose formation across the fields and woodlands that surrounded the prison, drawn by some combination of sound, scent, and the mysterious magnetism that seemed to pull the dead toward the living. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, the words barely audible over the autumn wind. Below him, Martinez was adjusting the radio frequency, trying to raise the other watchtowers for confirmation of what they were seeing. "How many?" Martinez asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer would be worse than anything they'd prepared for. Too many to count. Maybe 2,000. Maybe more. Darrell kept the binoculars trained on the approaching mass, trying to calculate their speed and direction. They're not moving fast, but they're not stopping either. At this rate, they'll hit the outer perimeter sometime tomorrow morning. The radio crackled to life as reports came in from the other observation posts. The herd was massive, larger than anything any of them had encountered before. More importantly, it was coming from multiple directions. Not a single concentrated mass that could be diverted or channeled, but a sprawling wave of death that would engulf the prison complex unless they found a way to either stop it or survive its passage. Within an hour, both communities had assembled in the prison's main courtyard for an emergency planning session. The integration that had seemed so successful during the quiet weeks of building and cooperation was about to face its ultimate test. Under the pressure of immediate existential threat, would the merged communities hold together, or would old divisions resurface as each group prioritized the survival of their own? Rick stood at the center of the gathering, his face grim as he outlined the tactical situation. We've got approximately 18 hours before the leading edge of the herd reaches our outer fence. Based on the size and distribution, our normal tactics aren't going to work. We can't thin them out enough with small teams, and we can't outrun them with this many people. From somewhere in the crowd, one of Philip's followers, a man named David, who'd never fully embraced the integration, spoke up with barely controlled panic in his voice. Then we need to evacuate, load up the vehicles, take what supplies we can carry, and find somewhere else to make a stand. The suggestion sparked immediate debate, voices rising as people argued about feasibility, safety, and the devastating cost of abandoning everything they'd built together. But Philip Blake stepped forward, his presence commanding enough attention that the crowd gradually fell silent. "Running isn't an option," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from experience rather than bluster. "Not with a herd this size. They'd catch our vehicles before we made it 5 miles. And even if we could outrun them, where would we go? Every other defensive position in the area is either already compromised or insufficient for a group this large." Herschel moved to stand beside Philip, his crutches clicking against the concrete as he positioned himself where everyone could see him. "Philip's right," he said. "Our best chance is to make our stand here, together. We know this ground. We've prepared these defenses. If we're going to survive this, it's going to be as a unified community." But even as he spoke, Herschel could feel something wrong in his chest, a tightness, a shortness of breath that had been building throughout the morning's crisis. The stress of coordinating between two communities under extreme pressure was taking its toll on a 70-year-old man who'd already survived more trauma and upheaval than anyone should have to endure. Rick began outlining the defensive strategy they'd need to implement. "We'll need to reinforce the outer fence, set up kill zones at the main approach routes, organize fallback positions if the perimeter gets breached. Glenn, I want you coordinating with Martinez on ammunition distribution. Carol, work with Lily on evacuation routes for the non-combatants. Darrell." He stopped speaking as Herschel suddenly staggered, his face going ashen as his left hand clutched at his chest. The old veterinarian's crutches clattered to the ground as he sank to his knees, his breathing becoming labored and irregular. "Herschel!" Maggie was the first to reach her father, dropping to the ground beside him, as others pressed close with medical supplies and desperate expertise. But even as hands reached out to help, even as voices called for space and bandages and someone to check his pulse, it was clear that their community's moral center, the man who'd held them together through the integration, who'd made cooperation possible through sheer force of compassionate will, was fighting for his life. The timing couldn't have been worse. With 18 hours until the herd's arrival, with 1,000 tactical decisions to make and 100 competing priorities to balance, the community was suddenly without its primary mediator. The person who'd bridged the gap between Rick's pragmatic leadership and Philip's tactical experience was unconscious, his breathing shallow, his face pale with the kind of vulnerability that reminded everyone how fragile all their successes really were. But instead of dissolving into chaos, something remarkable happened. Philip Blake looked around at the assembled communities, at people who'd been strangers 6 weeks ago, enemies 5 weeks ago, and neighbors for barely a month, and saw not 2 separate groups in crisis, but a single family facing a common threat. "Maggie, get him to the infirmary," he said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to making decisions under pressure. "Take whoever you need for medical support. The rest of us have work to do." Rick looked at Philip with an expression that might have been surprise. "You're taking charge." "I'm taking responsibility," Philip replied. "For these people, for this community, for proving that everything Herschel believed about redemption and cooperation wasn't just idealistic nonsense. We're going to save this place, all of us, together." What followed was the most intense 18 hours any of them had ever experienced. The defensive preparations required every able-bodied person working in coordinated teams that crossed all previous group boundaries. Philip's tactical knowledge proved invaluable. He understood walker behavior patterns, had experience with large-scale defensive operations, could coordinate multiple teams working on different aspects of the same problem. But more than that, he worked with Rick instead of trying to supplant him. Their leadership styles complemented each other in ways that surprised everyone, including themselves. Rick's deep understanding of the prison's defensive capabilities combined with Philip's broader strategic perspective to create plans that neither could have developed alone. "The main gate is our strongest point," Rick was saying as they huddled over hand-drawn maps of the prison complex. "But if the herd is as large as Darryl thinks, they'll overwhelm it through sheer pressure. We need to channel them into kill zones where we can thin their numbers without exposing our people." Philip nodded, studying the terrain features marked on the map. "The drainage ditches on the east side could work. If we block the culverts and flood the low ground, it'll slow them down enough for concentrated fire. But we'll need high ground positions for the shooters and clear evacuation routes if the positions get overrun." They worked through the night, both communities united by the shared understanding that survival depended on cooperation rather than competition. Darryl and Martinez coordinated the construction of elevated shooting positions. Glenn and Carol organized ammunition and medical supplies for rapid deployment. Even the children contributed, carrying messages between work teams and helping with tasks that didn't require adult strength or expertise. As dawn broke on the morning of the assault, the walker herd was visible as a dark line across the landscape, stretching from horizon to horizon like an advancing tide of death. The sight was terrifying in its scope. Thousands upon thousands of corpses shambling forward with mindless persistence, driven by hunger and instinct toward the warm, beating hearts sheltered behind the prison's walls. But the defenders were ready, not just tactically, but psychologically. Over the past 18 hours, the crisis had forged bonds that weeks of peaceful cooperation hadn't been able to create. People who'd been suspicious of each other yesterday were now trusting each other with their lives. Former enemies were covering each other's flanks. The integration that had been tentative and careful was now complete and absolute. The battle itself was unlike anything they'd faced before. Wave after wave of walkers pressed against their defenses, their sheer numbers threatening to overwhelm even the most carefully prepared positions. The sound was overwhelming. The constant groaning of thousands of corpses, the sharp crack of gunfire, the shouted commands as teams coordinated their fire or called for ammunition resupply. Philip found himself fighting beside Rick, both of them coordinating the defense from the main watchtower while their people held the line below. There was something surreal about the partnership. Two men who'd held swords to each other's throats, working together to protect their shared community. "Darryl's team is running low on ammo," Rick reported, watching the action through binoculars, "and Martinez's position is getting pressed hard on the eastern approach." "I'll take a resupply team to Darryl," Philip replied. "Can you reinforce Martinez without compromising the main gate?" "Carol's team can shift position, but if this keeps up much longer, we're going to have to consider falling back to the inner courtyard." The day wore on, the battle ebbing and flowing as the defenders held their positions against seemingly impossible odds. But gradually, through coordination and courage and the kind of stubborn refusal to surrender that had kept them alive this long, they began to turn the tide. The walker numbers were finite, despite their overwhelming initial presence. Each corpse that fell to gunfire or blade was one less threat pressing against their defenses. When the last walker finally fell silent in the late afternoon sun, when the gunfire faded to echoes and the groaning stopped, the prison complex looked like a battlefield. Bodies piled against the fences, ammunition scattered across the ground, blood and exhaustion marking everyone who'd survived the longest day any of them could remember. But they had survived. All of them. Not without cost. Several people had been injured, some seriously, and the psychological toll of fighting for 15 straight hours would take time to process. But the community had held. The integration had not only survived its ultimate test, but had been strengthened by it. In the infirmary, Herschel was slowly regaining consciousness, his heart attack stabilized through the kind of improvised medical care that the apocalypse had taught them all to provide. His first words, whispered through dry lips, were a question about the defense. When Maggie told him that everyone had survived, that the community had held together, that Philip and Rick had worked as partners throughout the crisis, tears ran down the old man's cheeks. That evening, as the combined communities gathered for a meal that felt more like a celebration than a simple dinner, Philip Blake found himself sitting beside Rick Grimes, both of them too exhausted for conversation, but comfortable with the shared silence that followed shared danger. "You know what I realized today?" Philip said finally, his voice rough from smoke and shouting. "Leadership isn't about being strong enough to protect everyone. It's about creating conditions where everyone can protect each other." Rick nodded, looking around at the faces of people who'd proven that cooperation wasn't just possible but powerful. Herschel was right about redemption, about second chances, about the possibility that people can choose to be better than what the world expects them to be. "Think he'll be proud of what we built here?" Rick considered the question, watching as former enemies shared food and stories, as children from both communities played together without awareness of the divisions that had once defined their parents, as two broken groups had become something stronger than either could have been alone. "I think he already is," Rick replied. "I think this is exactly what he was hoping would happen when he chose to walk toward that fence instead of away from it." As night settled over the prison and the community began the slow process of recovery and rebuilding, both men understood that something fundamental had changed. The test of external pressure hadn't broken their integration. It had completed it. They were no longer two groups sharing space. They were a single community that had proven its bonds were stronger than fear, stronger than suspicion, stronger than the kind of despair that had driven them to the edge of war. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new problems to solve, new tests of whether cooperation could survive the daily pressures of apocalyptic survival. But tonight, for the first time since the world ended, they slept as family. Not just people who'd learned to live together, but people who'd chosen to die together if necessary to protect what they'd built. It was, Philip reflected, as sleep finally claimed his exhausted mind, exactly what Penny would have wanted him to become. Not the governor, dealer in necessary deaths, but Philip Blake, protector of the living, builder of the world his daughter would have wanted to grow up in. It had taken the end of the world to teach him what strength really meant. But he'd learned. They'd all learned. And in learning, they'd proven that redemption wasn't just possible. It was powerful. Chapter 9. Ripples of Change. The first sign that their success had begun to spread beyond the prison walls came 6 weeks after the herd battle, when a lone survivor approached the main gate carrying a white cloth tied to a stick and a story that sounded too good to be true. His name was Father Gabriel Stokes, and he claimed to represent a network of small communities scattered across central Georgia, who'd been hearing rumors about a place where different groups had learned to live together without violence. "Is it true?" he asked Rick and Philip as they stood in the prison courtyard, his voice carrying the desperate hope of someone who'd spent too long believing that cooperation was impossible in the new world. "Did you really make peace with people who came to kill you? Did you really choose to share resources instead of fighting over them?" Rick and Philip exchanged glances, both recognizing the significance of the question. Their experiment in integration had been born out of necessity and sustained through mutual benefit, but they'd never considered that it might serve as inspiration for others struggling with similar conflicts. "It's true," Philip replied carefully, "but it wasn't easy, and it's not perfect. Building trust between former enemies requires constant work, constant choice to believe in the possibility of something better." Gabriel nodded, his expression suggesting that difficult was acceptable as long as it was possible. There are communities out there that want to try. People who are tired of fighting over scraps, tired of always looking over their shoulders for the next threat. Would you be willing to share what you've learned?" The conversation that followed stretched deep into the evening, touching on everything from practical conflict resolution techniques to the philosophical foundations that made cooperation possible. Gabriel wasn't just looking for tactical advice. He was seeking proof that human beings could choose to be something other than predators, that civilization could be rebuilt on foundations stronger than fear. But he wasn't the only one who'd heard about their success. Over the following weeks, the prison began receiving visits from other survivor groups, some seeking asylum, others looking for trade opportunities, still others simply wanting to see for themselves that peaceful coexistence was actually possible. The most significant arrival came on a rainy Tuesday morning, when 3 vehicles pulled up to the outer gate, carrying 12 people who looked like they'd been living rough for months. They were led by a man with striking red hair and a military bearing that suggested extensive combat experience, someone accustomed to making hard decisions under impossible circumstances. "Name's Abraham Ford," he announced to the reception committee that had assembled to evaluate the newcomers. "These are my people. We're heading to Washington, but we heard about what you're doing here. Heard you might be willing to take in people who are committed to working for the common good." The interview process that followed had become standardized over the past few weeks as more groups sought admission to their growing community. Herschel, despite still recovering from his heart attack, had insisted on participating in each evaluation, using his gift for reading people to assess whether potential newcomers would genuinely contribute to their cooperative model or might become sources of conflict. But it was Philip who surprised everyone by becoming the most vocal advocate for accepting Abraham's group, despite the obvious personality conflicts that would likely arise from integrating military-minded individuals into their consensus-based community structure. "They have skills we need," he argued during the leadership meeting that followed the initial interview. "Engineering expertise, medical training, combat experience that could be invaluable if we face another large-scale threat. More importantly, they're asking to join us rather than demanding accommodation. That suggests they're willing to adapt to our way of doing things." Rick was more skeptical. "Abraham strikes me as someone accustomed to command authority, not collaborative decision-making. Adding strong personalities to the mix could destabilize the balance we've worked so hard to achieve." "Or it could strengthen us," Philip replied. "We've proven that integration is possible between groups with fundamental ideological differences. But we've only tested that with people who are desperate enough to try anything. Abraham's group represents a different challenge. People who have other options, who could make it on their own, but who choose to join us because they believe in what we're building." The debate continued for hours, touching on resource allocation, security concerns, and the long-term sustainability of rapid population growth. The prison complex, which had originally been designed to house several hundred inmates, was now home to nearly 140 people, straining both infrastructure and social systems that had been built for much smaller numbers. Herschel listened to the arguments with the patience of someone who'd learned that the most important decisions couldn't be rushed. When the discussion finally turned to him for guidance, he spoke slowly, his voice still carrying the slight weakness that had persisted since his heart attack. "The question isn't whether we can afford to accept them," he said. "The question is whether we can afford not to. Every person we turn away is someone who might have contributed to building something better. Every group we refuse is a community that continues to struggle with problems we've learned to solve." He paused, looking around at the faces of people who'd become his family through choice rather than blood, who'd proven that redemption and cooperation were possible even in the darkest circumstances. "We started this as an experiment between two groups. But if it's going to mean anything beyond our own survival, it has to become something bigger. It has to become a model that others can follow, a proof that human beings can choose to be better than what this world expects us to be." The vote, when it finally came, was unanimous in favor of accepting Abraham's group. But the decision came with conditions: a trial period during which the newcomers would be closely monitored, specific training in the community's conflict resolution protocols, and clear expectations about the collaborative leadership model that had replaced traditional hierarchical authority. Abraham himself adapted to the new environment with the flexibility of a professional soldier accustomed to operating under various command structures. But his presence, along with that of his companions, did begin to shift the social dynamics within the prison in ways that weren't immediately apparent. Eugene, the scientist in Abraham's group, brought technical knowledge that revolutionized their infrastructure capabilities. Within 2 weeks of his arrival, he designed improvements to their water purification system, electrical grid, and waste management protocols that significantly improved quality of life for everyone in the community. But Eugene also brought the kind of intellectual arrogance that sometimes clashed with the community's emphasis on collaborative decision-making. He was accustomed to being the smartest person in any room, to having his expertise accepted without question, to making technical decisions based on optimal efficiency rather than social consensus. The first serious conflict emerged during a community meeting about expanding their agricultural capabilities. Eugene had designed an ambitious irrigation system that would dramatically increase crop yields, but implementing it would require relocating several families from their current cell assignments and temporarily disrupting the memorial garden that had been established for people who died defending the community. "This is a technical problem with a technical solution," Eugene argued, when some community members expressed concern about the social and emotional costs of his proposal. "Optimal resource allocation requires prioritizing practical benefits over sentimental attachments." The response was swift and unified, voices rising in opposition not just to the specific proposal, but to the underlying assumption that technical efficiency should override community input. This was exactly the kind of conflict that had once led to violence, the moment when different philosophies about decision-making collided and threatened to fracture the collaborative bonds that held the community together. But instead of escalating into the kind of factional dispute that might have destroyed earlier attempts at cooperation, the conflict became an opportunity to refine and strengthen their governance systems. Herschel, despite his weakened condition, called for a formal mediation session where all perspectives could be heard and a consensus solution could be developed. "Eugene," Herschel said during the session, his voice gentle but firm, "your technical expertise is invaluable, and your desire to improve our agricultural capabilities comes from a genuine commitment to community welfare. But optimal solutions aren't just about maximizing efficiency. They're about maximizing acceptance, about creating outcomes that everyone can live with, even when they're not perfect, for any individual perspective. The process that followed became a model for resolving similar conflicts in the future. Technical expertise was balanced against emotional considerations. Practical benefits were weighed against social costs. Multiple alternatives were developed and evaluated until a solution emerged that incorporated Eugene's innovations while preserving the memorial garden and minimizing disruption to established living arrangements. But more importantly, the conflict resolution process created an opportunity to formalize the democratic governance structures that had been developing organically over the months of integration. What emerged was a council system with representatives from each major group within the community: the original prison residents, Philip's former followers, Abraham's group, and the various individual refugees who'd joined over time. The council met weekly to address resource allocation, policy decisions, and conflicts that couldn't be resolved at the interpersonal level, but it operated on principles of consensus and compromise rather than majority rule, ensuring that minority perspectives were heard and incorporated even when they couldn't dominate the final decision. Philip found himself elected to represent his former followers on the council, a role that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier, but now felt natural given his complete transformation from destroyer to builder. More significantly, his election was unanimous. Even people who'd once been his enemies now trusted him to represent their interests in community governance. "You know what I find remarkable about this?" Herschel asked him after the first council meeting, as they sat together in the prison library that had been converted into a community meeting space. 6 months ago, you were the governor. You made decisions unilaterally, enforced them through strength, believed that leadership meant having the power to impose your will on others. Philip nodded, recognizing the accuracy of the observation. And now I'm one voice among 7 on a council that makes decisions through discussion and compromise. It should feel like weakness, like a diminishment of authority. But it doesn't. Why not? Because strength isn't about having the power to control outcomes, Philip replied. It's about having the wisdom to influence them. Because leadership isn't about making decisions for other people. It's about creating conditions where people can make good decisions together. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger from one of the watchtowers, carrying news that would test their expanded community's commitment to their principles. Another group was approaching the prison, this time a collection of vehicles that appeared to be carrying wounded people, refugees from some disaster or conflict that had left them in desperate need of medical attention and shelter. But this group was larger than any they'd encountered before, perhaps 30 or 40 people, including children and elderly individuals who would strain their medical resources and housing capacity. Moreover, they appeared to be fleeing from some immediate threat, which meant accepting them might also mean accepting whatever danger they were running from. Philip stood up from his chair, the movement automatic and decisive. "I should go meet them," he said. "Help assess the situation, figure out what kind of assistance they need." Herschel smiled, recognizing the instinctive response of a man who'd learned to see newcomers as opportunities rather than threats, who'd transformed his protective instincts from keeping others out to bringing others in. 6 months ago, you would have seen a group that size as a threat to be eliminated or controlled, he observed. 6 months ago, I was afraid, Philip replied. Afraid that there wasn't enough safety to go around. Afraid that protecting the people I loved meant destroying the people I didn't. But this community taught me something different. It taught me that the only way to really protect anyone is to protect everyone. That safety isn't something you hoard, it's something you share. As he walked toward the main gate to meet the newest group of potential residents, Philip Blake reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From the governor, dealer in necessary deaths and architect of communities built on fear, to Philip Blake, advocate for refugees and builder of communities built on hope. The transformation hadn't been easy, hadn't been quick, hadn't been without cost, but it had been possible, and in being possible for him, it had proven possible for others. The ripples of change that had begun with Herschel's choice to walk toward a fence instead of away from it had spread far beyond the prison walls, inspiring communities across the region to attempt their own experiments in cooperation and redemption. As the new refugees approached the gate, carrying their wounded and their stories of loss and their desperate hope for sanctuary, Philip Blake prepared to welcome them home. Not because they deserved it, not because it was safe, not because it was easy, but because it was right. Because building a world worth living in required choosing hope over fear, inclusion over exclusion, the hard work of cooperation over the easy violence of conquest. The world was watching, other communities were listening, and the example they set here, in this unlikely place where former enemies had become family, would determine whether humanity's future would be built on the ruins of its past or on the foundation of its capacity for redemption. It was, Philip thought, as the refugees reached the gate and began sharing their stories of flight and fear and hope, exactly the kind of legacy that would make Penny proud, exactly the kind of world she would have wanted him to help build, exactly the kind of community where love was stronger than fear, where building was more powerful than destroying, where the best of human nature could flourish even in the worst of circumstances. Chapter 10. The Wisdom of Governance. The crisis that would ultimately define their community's character began not with external threats or resource shortages, but with a single sheet of paper found in a supply run 2 months after Abraham's group had settled into the prison routine. Eugene had been cataloguing medical supplies in what had once been a small clinic when he discovered a folder wedged behind a filing cabinet, its contents forgotten in the chaos of the world's collapse, but preserved by accident of placement. The folder contained incident reports from the Woodbury community, detailed accounts of disciplinary actions, resource allocations, and what could only be described as systematic brutality carried out under the governor's authority. Names, dates, descriptions of punishments that went far beyond what anyone had imagined during the integration process. Evidence of executions, of people disappeared for questioning authority, of a reign that had been built not just on strong leadership, but on the kind of terroristic control that made opposition impossible. Eugene brought the folder to Abraham, who brought it to the council, where 7 representatives of their carefully balanced community found themselves confronting information that threatened to unravel everything they'd built together. The documents painted a picture of Philip Blake that was far darker than anyone had fully understood, evidence that his transformation might be more recent and more fragile than they'd been willing to acknowledge. "This changes things," said Maria Gonzalez, who'd been elected to represent the individual refugees who'd joined the community over recent months. Her voice carried the controlled anger of someone who'd fled brutal leaders before, who'd learned to recognize the signs of autocratic power even when it wore the mask of benevolent authority. "We voted to integrate his people based on his apparent redemption. But this isn't about redemption from poor leadership or harsh decisions. This is about redemption from what can only be called war crimes." Around the council table, representatives shifted uncomfortably as they processed the implications. Abraham, his military background, making him particularly sensitive to the distinction between necessary discipline and systematic oppression, studied the documents with growing concern. "Some of this goes beyond harsh leadership," he said finally. "This is evidence of organized brutality, of using fear as a governing principle. If Philip Blake was capable of this level of systematic cruelty, how do we know he's incapable of returning to it under pressure?" Carol, representing the original prison community, looked around the table with the weary expression of someone who'd seen too many good intentions destroyed by hidden realities. "The question isn't what he was capable of," she said. "The question is what we're capable of. Are we the kind of community that throws people out when we learn uncomfortable truths about their past? Or are we the kind of community that makes decisions based on who people choose to be now, not who they used to be?" The debate that followed was unlike anything they'd experienced since the integration began. Voices rose in anger, fell to whispers of uncertainty, cracked with the emotional weight of trying to balance justice with mercy, accountability with forgiveness. Some argued for immediate expulsion, claiming that harboring someone responsible for such systematic violence made them complicit in his crimes. Others insisted that Philip's complete transformation proved the possibility of redemption even from the darkest past. But it was Tara, representing Philip's former followers, who asked the question that cut to the heart of their dilemma. What about the people who followed him? What about those of us who participated in the system he created? Are we also guilty of war crimes? Should we also be expelled? The silence that followed was deafening, because the truth was that most of Philip's former followers had, at minimum, been complicit in the system described in the documents. They'd followed orders, carried out punishments, participated in the enforcement mechanisms that had kept Woodbury under strict control. If guilt by association was the standard, then half their community would need to be expelled. Herschel, who'd been listening to the debate with the patient attention of someone accustomed to mediating impossible conflicts, finally spoke. "I think," he said slowly, his voice still carrying the slight tremor that had persisted since his heart attack, "that we need to hear from Philip himself. Not second-hand accounts of his transformation, not our own observations of his recent behavior, but his own complete testimony about what he did, why he did it, and what he believes about accountability for actions taken in positions of authority." The proposal sparked immediate controversy. Some council members argued that giving Philip a platform to defend his actions would legitimize atrocities that should be condemned without qualification. Others worried that a public accounting would traumatize his former followers, forcing them to relive experiences they'd been trying to process and move beyond. But Abraham, despite his own reservations about Philip's past, supported Herschel's proposal. "If we're going to make a decision about his place in this community," he said, "it should be an informed decision. That means hearing his account of what happened, his understanding of his responsibility for it, and his commitment to ensuring it never happens again." The community tribunal was scheduled for the following Sunday, giving everyone time to prepare for what would essentially be a trial, not in the legal sense, since they had no formal justice system, but in the deeper sense of a community examining its own values and deciding what kind of place it wanted to be. The week leading up to the tribunal was tense in ways the prison hadn't experienced since the early days of integration. Conversations stopped when Philip entered rooms. People examined his interactions with children, his responses to stress, his behavior during disagreements with new scrutiny. The easy camaraderie that had developed over months of shared work and common struggle was replaced by the careful watchfulness of people reassessing someone they'd thought they knew. Philip himself seemed almost relieved when the tribunal finally convened. The entire community gathered in the prison's main cafeteria, chairs arranged in concentric circles, with Philip sitting alone at the center, facing the questions and judgment of people who'd become his family, but who now had to decide whether that relationship could survive complete honesty about his past. Herschel served as moderator, despite several council members' suggestions that someone less personally invested in Philip's redemption should oversee the proceedings. "I have the most experience with conflict resolution," he said simply, "and this community has trusted me to mediate disputes before. More importantly, I'm the person who vouched for Philip's transformation most strongly. If anyone should be responsible for ensuring this process is fair to all perspectives, it should be me." The testimony that followed was exhaustive, painful, and brutally honest. Philip began with a chronological account of his governance in Woodbury, starting with his attempts to create safety through organization and discipline, progressing through increasingly harsh responses to challenges to his authority, and culminating in the systematic brutality documented in the recovered files. "I convinced myself that every escalation was necessary," he said, his voice steady but strained with the effort of complete honesty. "That maintaining order required demonstrating the consequences of disorder, that keeping the majority safe justified sacrificing individuals who threatened stability. But the truth is that I became addicted to the feeling of absolute control, to the certainty that came from being able to solve problems through force rather than negotiation." The questions that followed were relentless. Abraham wanted to understand the decision-making process behind specific executions. Maria demanded details about the suppression of dissent. Even Tara, representing his former followers, asked pointed questions about the psychological mechanisms he'd use to maintain compliance. But the most difficult moment came when a new arrival, one of the refugees who'd joined just weeks earlier, stood up during the open comment period. "My brother was at Woodbury," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "He left because he couldn't stomach what was happening there. He told me about the executions, the disappearances, the fear that kept everyone in line. He died 3 months ago in a walker attack while trying to find a community where people could live without terror." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, that Philip's actions had directly contributed to her brother's death, that his governance had driven away people who might have lived if they'd been able to remain in a safe community. It was an impossible equation. The lives lost due to his brutality weighed against the lives saved by the safety his brutality had provided. Philip met her eyes directly, his own filled with tears that he made no attempt to hide. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "Not sorry that I got caught. Not sorry that there are consequences, but genuinely sorry that my choices contributed to your brother's death. Sorry that my failure to lead with compassion instead of fear made it impossible for him to stay somewhere safe." The testimony continued for 6 hours, covering every aspect of Philip's governance that the community could remember or document. When it finally concluded, when every question had been asked and every perspective had been heard, Herschel called for a recess before the final deliberation and vote. The decision process itself reflected the democratic principles they'd been developing over months of shared governance. No single person would decide Philip's fate. The entire adult community would vote, with the understanding that they were setting precedents for how future conflicts would be resolved. But the debate that preceded the vote revealed fundamental differences in how community members understood justice, redemption, and the relationship between past actions and present character. Some argued that certain crimes were beyond forgiveness, that systematic brutality disqualified someone from community membership, regardless of subsequent transformation. Others insisted that holding people accountable for past actions while embracing their current choices was exactly the kind of complex moral reasoning that distinguished civilization from mere survival. "The question," said Carroll during the final debate, isn't whether we can forgive Philip for what he did. The question is whether we can build a community that's strong enough to include people who've done terrible things, wise enough to hold them accountable without destroying them, and committed enough to our principles to offer redemption even when it's difficult. Abraham, despite his military background and appreciation for clear lines of accountability, found himself supporting Philip's continued membership. "I've served under commanders who made decisions that got people killed," he said. "I've made decisions that got people killed. The difference between necessary leadership and criminal brutality isn't always clear in the moment. But what's clear to me is that Philip Blake today is not the same person who committed those crimes. And if we expel him for who he used to be, we're saying that transformation doesn't matter, that people are defined forever by their worst moments." When the vote finally came, it was closer than anyone had expected. 43 votes for allowing Philip to remain in the community, 37 votes for expulsion, 12 abstentions from people who felt unable to make the decision. Not the overwhelming endorsement that would have settled the matter conclusively, but a clear enough majority to establish community policy. But the decision came with conditions that reflected the complexity of the choice they'd made. Philip would continue as a member of the community, but under ongoing oversight that included regular check-ins with a monitoring committee, restrictions on his ability to hold formal leadership positions, and a commitment to community service that would demonstrate his dedication to building rather than destroying. More importantly, the tribunal process itself had established principles for future governance that went far beyond Philip's individual case. They'd proven that their community could handle serious internal conflicts through democratic deliberation rather than authoritarian decree. They'd created precedents for accountability that balanced individual redemption with community safety. They demonstrated that mercy and justice could coexist, that rehabilitation and punishment could be combined in ways that strengthened rather than weakened their collective bonds. As the community dispersed following the vote, as people processed the decision and its implications, Herschel found himself sitting alone in the now empty cafeteria, exhausted but satisfied. They'd faced their greatest internal test and emerged stronger, more unified, more committed to the principles that distinguished them from the countless communities that had collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions. Philip approached him as he prepared to leave, his face showing the relief and humility of someone who'd been given a second chance he wasn't sure he deserved. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for advocating for the process, for ensuring I had a chance to tell my story completely, for creating space for the community to make its own decision about my fate." "Don't thank me," Herschel replied, pulling himself slowly to his feet with the help of his crutches. "Thank them. Thank the community that chose to believe in redemption, even when it was difficult. Thank the people who voted to include you, even after learning the worst things you'd done. Thank the democracy that made mercy possible while maintaining accountability." As they walked together toward their respective sleeping areas, Herschel reflected on the path that had brought them to this moment. From the sword at his throat to the votes for Philip's continued membership, from the potential war between communities to the peaceful resolution of their greatest internal crisis. It had taken months to build trust between former enemies. It would take years to fully integrate the growing community, to establish the institutions and traditions that would sustain their experiment in cooperative governance. But tonight, for the first time since the integration began, Herschel was confident that they'd built something strong enough to survive not just external threats, but internal challenges, something resilient enough to grow without losing its essential character. They'd proven that democracy could work even in the apocalypse, that mercy could coexist with justice, that people could choose to be better than their worst impulses, individually and collectively. That redemption wasn't just possible but powerful, capable of transforming not just individuals, but entire communities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of whether their principles could survive the pressures of continued growth and evolving circumstances. But tonight, they slept as a community that had chosen wisdom over vengeance, inclusion over exclusion, the hard work of democracy over the easy certainty of autocracy. It was, Herschel thought as sleep finally claimed his weary mind, exactly the kind of world worth building, exactly the kind of community worth dying for, exactly the kind of future that proved human beings were capable of choosing hope over fear, love over hatred, the difficult path of cooperation over the simple brutality of conquest. Chapter 11. Legacy of Peace. 6 months after the tribunal that had tested their community's commitment to redemption, the prison complex looked nothing like the fortress under siege it had been a year earlier. What struck visitors most wasn't the expanded infrastructure or the bustling activity of over 200 residents, but the sound, the constant hum of conversation, laughter, children playing, people working together, without the undercurrent of fear that characterized most survivor settlements. The transformation was most visible from the main watchtower, where Rick Grimes and Philip Blake stood together on a crisp November morning, reviewing the day's schedule of diplomatic meetings, trade negotiations, and the kind of routine administrative business that had once seemed impossible in a world dedicated to moment-by-moment survival. The delegation from Columbus arrives at 10, Rick was saying, consulting the handwritten schedule that had become their equivalent of a government calendar. They want to discuss establishing a formal trade agreement for medical supplies in exchange for our agricultural surplus. Abraham thinks we can probably negotiate favorable terms, especially if they're willing to include their metalworking expertise as part of the arrangement. Philip nodded, studying the convoy of vehicles approaching through the morning mist. What about the conflict resolution training? Are we still scheduled to send a team to help with the situation near Macon? Herschel insists he's well enough to lead the mediation himself, Rick replied. Carol's going with him, along with 2 of the newer mediators from our training program. If they can help those communities work through their resource disputes peacefully, it'll be another proof of concept for our model. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of children's voices drifting up from the prison yard, where Beth had established what could only be called a school, though it bore little resemblance to the educational institutions that had existed before the world changed. Instead of isolated classrooms and standardized curricula, learning happened through integrated activities that combined practical skills with theoretical knowledge, collaboration with individual achievement, intellectual development with emotional growth. This morning's lesson was taking place in the agricultural zone, where a group of 15 children, ranging in age from 6 to 16, were learning about crop rotation through hands-on planning of next season's planting schedule. But the real education was happening in the spaces between the formal instruction, children from different backgrounds working together to solve problems, older kids teaching younger ones, the kind of natural cooperation that emerged when competition was replaced by collaboration as the fundamental organizing principle. You know what strikes me about them? Philip asked, watching a 10-year-old girl who'd been born at the prison help a newcomer understand the community's approach to resource sharing. They don't think of survival and cooperation as contradictory. For them, working together isn't a strategy for staying alive. It's just how people naturally behave when they're not taught to see each other as threats. Rick followed his gaze to where Carl was demonstrating proper seed spacing to a group of younger children, his explanation patient and detailed in ways that would have been impossible before the integration had taught their community that knowledge was something to be shared rather than hoarded. Carol calls them the post-war generation, kids who've never known a time when different groups couldn't work together, when conflict was the default response to disagreement. The term was more accurate than Rick had initially realized. The children who'd grown up in their integrated community approached problems with fundamentally different assumptions than the adults who'd lived through the early chaos of the apocalypse. Where older residents still occasionally fell back on competitive thinking, the children instinctively sought collaborative solutions. Where adults sometimes struggled with trust, the children seemed to operate from a baseline assumption that people were fundamentally good until proven otherwise. It was most visible during the community meetings that had become weekly traditions, where policy decisions were made through the democratic processes they'd developed over months of trial and refinement. Adult discussions could become heated, touched by memories of betrayal and loss that made consensus difficult to achieve. But when children participated, and their voices were increasingly included as the community recognized the value of their perspectives, conversations became more patient, more creative, more focused on finding solutions that worked for everyone, rather than just achieving victory for particular viewpoints. The medical clinic that had evolved in the prison's former infirmary represented another aspect of their community's transformation from survival-focused settlement to genuine civilization. What had begun as basic first aid for residents had expanded to serve as a regional medical center, drawing patients from communities across central Georgia who'd heard about the quality of care available within the prison walls. Dr. Caleb Subramanian, who'd arrived 3 months earlier with a group of refugees from Atlanta, now oversaw a medical operation that included not just emergency trauma care, but routine health maintenance, prenatal services, and even basic surgical procedures. More importantly, the clinic operated on principles that reflected the community's broader values. Treatment was provided based on need rather than ability to pay. Medical knowledge was shared freely with other communities, and healing was understood as something that extended beyond individual patients to encompass the social and emotional health of entire populations. The remarkable thing, Dr. Subramanian had explained during a recent community meeting, isn't just that we're able to provide advanced medical care in a post-apocalyptic environment. It's that we're able to do it in a way that strengthens rather than strains community bonds. When people know that medical care is a right rather than a privilege, when they understand that everyone's health contributes to everyone's security, they're more willing to take the risks and make the sacrifices that genuine healthcare requires. The clinic's success had attracted attention from far beyond their immediate region. Medical professionals from as far away as Virginia and Florida had made pilgrimages to the prison, not just to learn technical procedures, but to understand how healthcare could function as a tool for community building rather than individual profit. The knowledge they carried back to their own communities was spreading the prison's model of cooperative service far beyond what any single diplomatic mission could have achieved. But perhaps the most significant transformation was visible in the agricultural zones that Philip now oversaw, with the same attention to detail he'd once devoted to military planning. What had begun as subsistence farming to feed their own population had evolved into something approaching agricultural science, with experimental plots testing new crops, innovative irrigation systems, maximizing yield from limited water resources, and crop rotation schedules designed to improve soil quality over multiple seasons. The agricultural surplus that resulted from this systematic approach had become the foundation of their trade relationships with other communities, but more importantly, it had provided evidence that cooperation could generate genuine abundance rather than just redistributing scarcity. Communities that had spent years fighting over limited resources were discovering that working together could actually expand what was available to be shared. The old model was based on zero-sum thinking, Philip explained to a group of agricultural specialists visiting from Tennessee. The assumption that if one community had more food, other communities necessarily had less. But when you share knowledge, coordinate planting schedules, and help each other solve problems, everyone ends up with more than they would have achieved working alone. The lesson had implications that extended far beyond farming. Trade networks that had begun as simple resource exchanges were evolving into information-sharing relationships, technological collaboration, and the kind of mutual aid agreements that formed the foundation of genuine alliances. The prison had become not just a successful community, but a model that other settlements were actively trying to replicate. Herschel's conflict resolution training program represented the most direct way their community's principles were spreading to influence broader regional politics. What had begun as informal mediation services for nearby communities had evolved into a systematic program that trained mediators, developed conflict resolution protocols, and provided ongoing support for communities attempting to resolve internal disputes peacefully. The program operated out of what had once been the prison's chapel, a space that Herschel had transformed into something between a classroom and a therapy center. Participants came from across the Southeast to spend weeks learning not just the techniques of mediation, but the underlying philosophy that made peaceful resolution possible. The belief that people were fundamentally capable of cooperation, that conflicts arose from circumstances rather than inherent evil, that patient dialogue could accomplish more than forceful confrontation. The most important thing we teach, Herschel explained to each new group of trainees, isn't how to resolve specific conflicts. It's how to create communities where serious conflicts are less likely to arise in the first place. It's how to build social structures that channel disagreement toward productive dialogue rather than destructive confrontation. The success rate of communities that implemented the prison's conflict resolution model was remarkably high, not perfect, but significantly better than the regional average for peaceful dispute resolution. More importantly, communities that successfully resolved one major conflict using their training were more likely to handle future disputes peacefully, suggesting that the skills and principles were genuinely taking root rather than just providing temporary solutions. As winter approached, the prison community was preparing for the season with a confidence that would have been unthinkable during their early months of integration. Food stores were abundant, medical supplies were adequate, shelter was secure for all residents. But beyond mere survival, they were planning for expansion, additional infrastructure projects, new trade relationships, innovative programs that would further develop their model of cooperative governance. The evening community meetings had evolved into something approaching town halls, where residents shared news from other communities, discussed policy proposals, and planned collective projects that stretched months into the future. The ability to think beyond immediate survival, to make plans based on confidence rather than desperation, represented perhaps the most significant measure of their success. "I've been thinking about legacy," Rick said to Philip, as they concluded their morning planning session and prepared to join the day's round of diplomatic meetings, "about what we're building here, and whether it's strong enough to outlast us." Philip considered the question, watching as their community went about its daily business with the easy efficiency of people who'd learned to work together so naturally that cooperation had become second nature. "I think legacy isn't about building something that lasts forever," he replied. "It's about proving that better is possible, about demonstrating that human beings can choose to be more than what circumstances force them to be." Around them, the prison hummed with the activities of a civilization in the process of rebuilding itself from the ground up. Children learning that collaboration was stronger than competition, adults discovering that vulnerability could be a source of strength rather than weakness. Communities across the region implementing models of governance based on consensus rather than conquest. It was, both men understood, exactly what Herschel had envisioned when he'd chosen to walk toward that fence instead of away from it. Exactly what Dale would have wanted to see. Proof that humanity's capacity for cooperation was stronger than its tendency toward conflict. Exactly what Penny Blake would have been proud to see her father help build. The world was watching. Other communities were learning. And the example being set within these prison walls was proving that redemption wasn't just possible for individuals, but for entire civilizations, that the future could be built on cooperation rather than conquest, that human beings could choose hope over fear even in the darkest circumstances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new visitors seeking to learn from their model, new opportunities to prove that sustainable peace was possible even in a world that seemed designed for perpetual warfare. But today, for the first time since the world ended, they weren't just surviving, they were thriving. They weren't just staying alive, they were proving that life could be worth living. And in proving that, they were offering hope to everyone still struggling to believe that better was possible, that cooperation was achievable, that the future could be something more than just an endless repetition of humanity's worst impulses. They were proving that redemption was real, that transformation was achievable, that love could be stronger than fear if people were willing to choose it consistently, courageously, one decision at a time. Chapter 12. The garden grows. 3 years had passed since the tribunal that had tested their community's commitment to redemption, and the prison complex bore almost no resemblance to the fortress under siege it had once been. What visitors noticed first wasn't the expanded infrastructure or the bustling activity of nearly 300 residents, but the laughter, the constant sound of children playing without fear, adults working without suspicion, families growing without the shadow of imminent violence that had defined life in the early years after the world changed. Herschel Green, now 74 and moving more slowly on his crutches, but still sharp as ever in his understanding of human nature, spent his mornings in the memorial garden that had become the spiritual center of their community. The garden occupied what had once been the prison's execution yard, transformed from a place of ending into a place of remembrance and renewal. Each plant had been chosen to honor someone who'd died in the conflicts that had brought their communities together, the people of Woodbury who'd perished under the governor's harsh rule, the prison residents who'd fallen defending their home, the countless unnamed victims of the fear and mistrust that had once defined human relationships in the post-apocalyptic world. Philip Blake, still Philip, never governor, the title buried along with the man who'd once worn it like armor against his own humanity, knelt among the rose bushes with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that growing things required the same patience and dedication as rebuilding oneself. His hair had gone completely grey, his face lined with years of honest work and restful sleep, his hands gentle as he tended plants that had been chosen not for their practical value, but for their beauty, their symbolism, their ability to transform a place of death into a place of life. "The white roses are doing well this year," he said to Herschel, who'd settled onto one of the benches that allowed him to oversee the garden work without straining his increasingly fragile legs. "I think it's the new irrigation system Eugene designed. More consistent water distribution, less stress on the root systems." Herschel nodded, watching as Philip worked among flowers that would have seemed impossibly frivolous during their early days of desperate survival. But frivolity, they'd learned, was one of the first signs of genuine security, the ability to invest time and energy in things that served the soul rather than just the body, that fed hope rather than just hunger, that proved life could be about more than just staying alive from one day to the next. The memorial service went well yesterday, Herschel observed, referring to the quarterly ceremony where the community gathered to remember those who died in the conflicts that had preceded their integration. Young Marcus gave a beautiful reading from Dale's journals. I think Dale would have been proud to see his words inspiring a generation that's never known a world where different groups couldn't work together. The memorial services had evolved over the years, from somber occasions focused on loss to celebrations that emphasized the lessons learned from tragedy, the growth that had emerged from suffering, the hope that had been built on foundations of carefully remembered grief. They were attended not just by community residents, but by visitors from across the region who came to pay respects to the people whose deaths had, in some cosmic sense, made their current peace possible. The transformation was perhaps most visible in the children who'd grown up within the prison's walls, who played games that would have been unimaginable during the early days of the apocalypse. Instead of war games or survival scenarios, they played elaborate, cooperative adventures where different groups worked together to solve problems, where conflict was resolved through negotiation rather than violence, where the goal wasn't victory over others, but achievement with others. This morning, a group of 8-year-olds had organized what they called a peace mission, a game where they pretended to be diplomats, visiting communities that couldn't agree on resource allocation, helping them find solutions that worked for everyone involved. The game was remarkably sophisticated in its understanding of conflict resolution principles, incorporating techniques they'd absorbed from watching the adults in their lives handle disagreements through patient dialogue rather than angry confrontation. "Look at them," Philip said, gesturing toward the children as he moved to tend a section of lavender that had been planted to honor Penny's memory. "They don't even understand that what they're playing used to be impossible. For them, cooperation isn't a learned skill. It's just how the world works." The observation was particularly poignant given the community celebration that was scheduled for that evening. Sarah Chen, who'd arrived 2 years earlier as part of a refugee group from Atlanta, was marrying David Martinez, son of the Martinez who'd once served as Philip's lieutenant, but who'd become one of their most effective community organizers. The wedding would be the first formal union between members of formerly opposing groups, a symbolic milestone that represented the complete integration of their community. But more than symbolism, the wedding represented the kind of normal human joy that had seemed impossible during the early years of survival-focused existence. Sarah and David had met during a joint construction project, fallen in love during shared work details, proposed during a community meeting where their happiness had become a source of collective celebration rather than individual achievement. Their marriage would be officiated by Herschel, witnessed by the entire community, and celebrated with food, music, and the kind of ritualized joy that marked the transition from mere survival to genuine living. The prison walls themselves had become canvases for the community's artistic expression, decorated with murals that told the story of their journey from conflict to cooperation. The largest mural, painted across the entire southern wall, depicted the moment when Philip had dropped Michonne's sword and chosen redemption over revenge. But the artwork didn't end with that single scene. It continued chronologically around the complex, showing the integration process, the Walker herd defense, the tribunal, the growth of trade networks, the establishment of the school and clinic, the countless small moments of choice that had transformed enemies into family. The murals served multiple purposes beyond mere decoration. They provided historical education for children who hadn't lived through the early conflicts, inspiration for visitors who needed proof that transformation was possible, and ongoing reminders for residents about the principles that had made their success possible. But perhaps most importantly, they demonstrated that their community valued beauty alongside utility, creativity alongside productivity, the kind of cultural expression that elevated human existence beyond mere biological persistence. The radio network that had developed over the past year had connected their community with 47 other settlements across the southeast, creating a web of communication and mutual aid that resembled the early stages of regional government. The daily radio check-ins had evolved from simple status reports to collaborative planning sessions, technical consultations, and the kind of ongoing dialogue that suggested genuine political integration might be possible on a larger scale. Abraham Ford, now serving as their primary liaison with external communities, had developed protocols for information sharing, resource coordination, and joint response to regional threats that went far beyond anything they'd originally imagined possible. The radio network had facilitated peaceful resolution of dozens of intercommunity conflicts, coordinated responses to walker herds and severe weather events, and created the foundation for trade relationships that were improving quality of life across the entire region. The Virginia communities want to send a delegation next month, Abraham reported during that morning's leadership meeting. They've been trying to implement our conflict resolution model, but they're having trouble with some of the consensus-building techniques. They think a 2-week intensive training program might help them work through the remaining obstacles. The request was one of dozens they'd received, as word of their success spread beyond the immediate region. Communities from as far away as Texas and Pennsylvania had sent representatives to learn their integration methods, study their governance structures, and understand the philosophical foundations that made cooperation possible even under extreme stress. But the most significant measure of their success was visible in the way new arrivals approached their community. Instead of desperate individuals fleeing immediate danger, they now hosted entire families who'd heard about their quality of life and chose to relocate for positive reasons rather than negative ones. Instead of refugees seeking temporary shelter, they welcomed permanent residents who wanted to contribute to building something better than what they'd left behind. The afternoon's arrival was typical of the new pattern. A convoy of 3 vehicles carrying the Rodriguez family from Florida, including grandparents, parents, and 5 children, ranging in age from 3 to 17. They came not because they were fleeing violence or starvation, but because they wanted their children to grow up in a community where cooperation was the norm rather than the exception, where education was available, where medical care was guaranteed, where the future looked brighter than the past. "Welcome home," Philip said, as he greeted the family at the main gate, words that had become his standard greeting, but that carried the weight of genuine invitation. "We're glad you chose to join us. We're glad you believed that better was possible." The integration process for the Rodriguez family would take months, learning community protocols, finding their place in the social and economic structures, adapting to governance systems based on consensus rather than authority. But the process itself had been refined through years of experience, supported by mentorship programs and orientation systems that helped newcomers understand not just the practical aspects of community life, but the philosophical foundations that made it work. As evening approached, and the community gathered for Sarah and David's wedding ceremony, Herschel found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the sword at his throat to the celebration of love between former enemies, from the potential war between communities to the peaceful integration of hundreds of people from dozens of different backgrounds. The wedding ceremony itself took place in the prison's main courtyard, decorated with flowers from their memorial garden and artwork created by community members who'd discovered that survival could coexist with creativity, that practical necessity didn't preclude beauty. Herschel officiated with words that drew from multiple religious traditions represented in their community, emphasizing themes of forgiveness, renewal, and the choice to build rather than destroy. "Sarah and David," he said to the couple standing before him, surrounded by faces that represented every stage of their community's evolution. "You represent something precious and powerful, proof that love can bloom even in the darkest circumstances, that hope can survive even the worst tragedies, that human beings can choose to be better than what circumstances demand of them." The celebration that followed lasted deep into the night, with music and dancing and the kind of communal joy that had seemed impossible during the early years of apocalyptic survival. Children played among adults who watched them with protective tenderness rather than anxious fear. Elderly residents shared stories with newcomers who listened with respectful attention rather than suspicious wariness. Former enemies toasted each other's health and happiness with genuine affection rather than forced politeness. But the evening's most significant moment came just before the formal festivities began, when Herschel gathered a group of children around him in the prison library for what had become a weekly tradition. Story time had evolved from simple entertainment to something approaching religious service, where the community's youngest members learned about the principles that had made their peaceful existence possible. "Tonight," Herschel said, settling into the chair that had been positioned where all the children could see him clearly, "I want to tell you about forgiveness, about second chances, about the power that comes from choosing hope instead of fear, love instead of hatred, building instead of destroying." The children listened with the rapt attention of young minds, encountering ideas that would shape their understanding of what human beings were capable of achieving together. Some were too young to fully grasp the complexity of what he was teaching, but all of them absorbed the emotional reality, the understanding that conflict could be resolved peacefully, that different didn't have to mean enemy, that the future could be built on cooperation rather than conquest. "A long time ago," Herschel continued, opening his well-worn Bible to passages he'd marked for their relevance to the lessons their community had learned, "people forgot how to live together peacefully. They forgot that they were all part of the same family, that hurting others meant hurting themselves, that building together was stronger than fighting alone. But they remembered. They chose to remember. And in remembering, they built something beautiful." Through the library windows, the rest of the community was visible celebrating Sarah and David's wedding, their laughter and music creating a soundtrack for the story Herschel was telling about the power of redemption to transform not just individuals, but entire civilizations. The scene was one of perfect integration, former enemies dancing together, children playing without fear, elderly residents sharing wisdom with attentive listeners, the kind of multi-generational cooperation that suggested genuine sustainability rather than temporary success. But the most important thing, Herschel said as the story reached its conclusion and the children prepared to join the celebration outside, is that this beautiful thing they built wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. Because once people remember how to choose love over fear, how to build instead of destroy, how to forgive instead of holding grudges, they can teach others to remember too. And those others can teach others. And slowly, carefully, patiently, the whole world can remember what it means to be family. As the children ran outside to rejoin the celebration, Herschel remained in the library for a few more minutes, looking through the windows at the community they'd built together. 300 people living in harmony, despite coming from dozens of different backgrounds, holding dozens of different beliefs, carrying dozens of different histories of loss and trauma and survival. The prison complex stretched around him, its walls no longer barriers against the world, but foundations for a better world. Its cells no longer places of confinement, but homes for families who'd chosen cooperation over competition, hope over despair, the difficult path of building together over the easier route of fighting alone. In the distance, the radio tower blinked its regular signal to the 47 other communities that had joined their network of mutual aid and shared governance. Further still, walker herds moved across abandoned landscapes that would someday be reclaimed and rebuilt by people who'd learned that human cooperation could accomplish what individual strength never could. But here, tonight, in this place that had once been a symbol of society's failure to solve its problems peacefully, hundreds of people were celebrating a wedding between former enemies, teaching children to choose love over fear, proving that redemption was not just possible but powerful enough to transform the world. It was, Herschel reflected, as he slowly made his way toward the celebration that would continue long into the night. Exactly what Dale would have wanted to see. Exactly what Penny Blake would have wanted her father to become. Exactly what humanity could achieve when it chose to be guided by its highest aspirations, rather than its deepest fears. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new visitors seeking to learn from their model, new opportunities to prove that cooperation could survive any test. But tonight, for the first time since the world ended, they weren't just surviving or even thriving. They were flourishing. They weren't just staying alive. They were proving that life could be beautiful. And in proving that, they offered hope to everyone still struggling in the darkness, still believing that conflict was inevitable, still trapped in the assumption that human beings were fundamentally incapable of choosing love over fear. They were proof that the future could be built on forgiveness rather than vengeance, cooperation rather than conquest, the patient work of growing gardens rather than the quick satisfaction of burning bridges. The garden grew, the children laughed, the community celebrated, and somewhere in the distance, other communities watched and learned, and slowly began to believe that better was possible, that transformation was achievable, that the world could be redeemed one choice, one person, one community at a time.